we close softly, so the earth can keep telling its story, and in that hush, we notice how the ground itself seems to breathe, a long, slow breath that takes millions of years to rise and fall, as if memory for a planet is not kept in words, but in motion, in layers, in the quiet rearrangement of what sinks and what returns. We imagine how a coastline can come undone grain by grain, how a city might slide toward the sea, not with panic, but with patience, not because it is weak, but because water loves pathways and pathways remember where to go. We picture alloys pitted by salt, glass softened to frosted pebbles, the neat angles of our making rounded by tides until geometry is just a rumor in sand. Maybe a library becomes a drift becomes a bar becomes a shoal, and in that shoal tiny creatures build with calcium, the fragile apartments of their lives, borrowing our dust without knowing our name. It is not erasure out of spite, but a kind of kindness that the ocean practices, returning everything to a language it understands, silts, clays, shells, the whispering clatter of grains rolling in the longshore current. And beneath this surface patience, deeper patience is at work, plates moving like vast rafts, the salt rising through seams, old seabeds sliding downward in slow arcs, where heat and pressure turn memory into something tougher, something less personal. If parts of us were ever carried out past the shelf edge and rained down as a snow of fragments, could they be drawn into that dark conveyor? Could they be pressed into schists and gneisses that sing of pressure but do not remember our alphabet? We hold the thought gently, not because we hope to be found, but because we are learning how loss is woven into the physics of a living planet. The fossil record reminds us that even bone must bargain with minerals. It survives not by holding on, but by changing, trade by trade, pore by pore, until identity becomes lattice and vacancy becomes crystal. Could our wires become ore, our pigments become clays with odd colors, our carbon a small surge in a layer that future eyes read as a brief fever? Maybe not. The ratios we leave, carbon heavier or lighter by a breath, nitrogen nudged, lead whispering its half-life lullabies, are clocks and signatures that do not know our stories and do not need to. And yet, what if memory is not just in the measurable curves, but in the shapes of absence too, the flat places where a delta once sprawled with light, the abrupt truncation in a reef, the lacquered sheen of a lake bed that once carried smoke and now carries silence? Not because the earth is trying to forget, but because remembering on this scale is a matter of rearrangement, one particle joining another like a thought, taking a new form. We slow our breathing to match the planet's unhurried pulse, and in that rhythm we begin to see how entropy is both the author and the editor, loosening, mixing, thinning the ink until the page can be written on again. Still, questions drift back like tide foam. What if an older cadence once played along these shores, a pattern of heat and light that left only a faint aftertaste in the dust? Could it be that we are stepping over stories that require not eyes but patience to read? Is it possible that our most durable traces will be the ones we never meant to leave, the stray isotopes, the altered clays, the subtle mismatch between what should be and what is? We are not afraid of this thought. We rest inside it, the way one rests beside a river in evening, trusting the water to go on being water. Not because we are certain, but because uncertainty here is generous, letting us imagine without claiming, letting us listen without demanding applause. Night gathers, the surf keeps its soft arithmetic, counting pebbles, uncounting them, and somewhere offshore, particles begin a slow descent, each one a small decision toward forgetting and toward form. And if this much can be gentled, if this much can be folded back into the planet's quiet work, then the next question rises like a tide against the dark. What signs, if any, could pass through so many hands of time and still be heard as a human voice? And if they can, would we recognize our own echo when it returns? And if they can, would we recognize our own echo when it returns? Or would it feel like a distant weather, familiar in pattern but nameless in origin, moving through us the way ancient wind moves through a canyon shaped by hands we never met. We linger with that, not because we crave certainty, but because uncertainty is a soft room where ideas can breathe, where geology sits beside memory and both learn a slower language. In that language, deep time does not hurry. It seeps, it stacks, it waits, and we begin to see how a trace can be carried through cycles, not because it resists decay, but because decay itself is a kind of courier, passing material from form to form, from light to ash, from ash to ocean, from ocean to stone. We imagine a single grain, born from glass that once bore a view, broken to sand by heat and weather, washed out by a rain that forgot the street's name, meeting the estuary where salt writes a new alphabet, and then under a grey sky, that grain steps into the continental shelf like someone crossing a threshold without a sound. There the ocean's patient snowfall begins, microskeletons, dust from deserts half a planet away, the fine soot of fires, the invisible drift of our breath, all of it settling, not as a burial but as a continuous lullaby pressed into layers thin as a whisper. Maybe, in the chemistry of those layers, a small imbalance forms, a fraction of a fraction that means carbon is a shade heavier, or nitrogen took a path. It usually doesn't, a path shaped by burning, or by synthesis, or by the brief fever of a species that learned to move ancient sunlight back into the air. Maybe, maybe not. We picture isotope trails like murmurs in a crowded room, not because they shout but because they persist, half-life after half-life, outlasting stories while forgetting their characters, and we wonder whether such murmurs are enough to outwalk subduction, that slow descending escalator where an old seafloor tilts downward and is welcomed into heat, that loosens every memory into new beginnings. Could it be that some layers escape, scraped off the sinking plate and glued to the growing edge of continents, raised in a future mountain where a geologist with cold fingers chips a slate and sees, not a sentence but a cadence of altered ratios, a subtle pigment locked in clay, a line that is almost a question mark, and yet the ocean is not only a vault, it is also a dissolver, a maker of distances that change the story by lengthening it, and we sit with this, not because we fear loss, but because loss here is part of the rhythm that makes room for what comes next. The atmosphere keeps its own diary, thin and restless, recording in ice and ring, and pour the slow dance of warmth and chill, the bright flare of a volcanic season, the quiet return of normal, and tucked within that diary might be a page where the handwriting stumbles, a sudden climb, a sudden tilt, a season that is too many seasons at once. Is it possible that a future reader, careful and patient, would touch that page and feel a pulse, not of disaster alone, but of intention, a pattern that looks like choice? We consider fossils, those negotiations between chemistry and chance, and notice how even their survival is an act of translation, protein to mineral, marrow to calcite, identity to structure, and we ask whether structures we build could make a similar bargain, not because we deserve it, but because matter does what matter does, forming new stability wherever it can. Perhaps copper conducts a memory into malachite veins, perhaps silicon takes on a milkier sheen where it once held light, perhaps iron offers its red to a formation that will, in some distant sunrise, color an entire cliff, perhaps not. Entropy loosens our narratives like threads, and yet those threads weave themselves elsewhere, in concretions that grow like thoughts around a seed, in layered valves that count winters we never knew, in peat that tastes of unlit summers, in coral that reads temperature the way we read feeling, quietly, repeatedly, with small variations that gather meaning over time. We rest inside this slow arithmetic, this gentle bookkeeping where nothing is really kept, only moved, and in that rest we feel a kind of humility that opens the heart to the possibility of other epochs, other hands, other echoes that never needed names. If memory exists at the scale of continents, then perhaps memory is less like a photograph and more like a tide pool after the wave has withdrawn. What remains is not the wave, but its shape in miniature, a curated stillness that holds hints of the larger motion. What if we have already walked past such pools, mistaking them for ordinary stone, because we ask them to speak our language instead of theirs? Could it be that to hear a planetary memory, we must become quiet enough to let the ratios talk, to let the clay answer, to let the wind finish its sentence? We imagine the next night of the world arriving with its usual gentleness, breath by breath, dune by dune, and somewhere under that soft dark, a layer is closing, another is beginning, and the scene between them is almost invisible, almost, but not quite, like a thin scar. A fingertip can feel better than an eye can see. We accept that most of our signs are soft, we accept that most of our questions will stay open, and we accept too that listening is a form of presence that leaves a lighter trace. The sea turns in its sleep, the crust sighs in its old bones, and above them, clouds make and unmake temporary continents of shadow over the water. And yet, if echoes can come home through chemistry and stone, if patterns can cross ages disguised as dust and light, what other signals might be hiding in forms we have not learned to read? What other kinds of pages might exist beyond bones and soot and ice, waiting for us to ask a better question? What other kinds of pages might exist beyond bones and soot and ice, waiting for us to ask a better question? This is where we linger, in the soft hallway between knowing and almost knowing, where the planet keeps a slower library and we learn to read with our hands instead of our hurry. We picture a cliff face at dusk, bands of color stacked like quiet music, each line a season held still, each shift a breath the world once took and then forgot to exhale, not because the memory failed, but because memory here is sedimentary, accumulating in patience, pruning in floods, resetting in the hush after storms. We think of clay as a listener, its layered sheets catching ions like rumors, holding on to whispers of metals and dyes and altered waters, not faithfully, but tenderly enough that a future touch might hear the faintest resonance. Could it be that somewhere a horizon of pale mud still carries the echo of an old combustion, a careful imbalance of carbon that is more than fire, less than voice? We imagine a cave where dripstone grows from the arithmetic of water, drop by drop, counting years not with numbers, but with trace impurities that tell of dust blown from distant deserts, of forests leaning in and out of existence, of air that learned to hold more heat for a while, and then, maybe, learned to let it go, stalagmites as diaries, stalactites as pens, and somewhere between them a comma long enough to fit a century. We remember that fossils themselves are not bodies, but agreements between decay and mineral, between absence and form, and we wonder if a city could ever enter such a pact, not because it wishes to last, but because chemistry is generous with anything that offers a shape, rebar rusting into hematite spines, glass easing into silica frost, copper sleeping inside green bloom, each material choosing a slower name. Perhaps a future mountain will carry our outlines as textures rather than artifacts, a grain that feels subtly wrong under a skilled thumb, a vein that turns a usual rock odd, not loudly, not proudly, just enough to ask. There is humility in that picture, and relief too, because the ocean still keeps its deep conveyor, subducting old floors down to heat and pressure that do not care for our symbols, and yet, not all is drawn under, some is scraped off, welded to the edges, lifted into air where wind and frost and sunlight begin their patient editing again. Maybe the most durable page is the one that never stops being written on, a palimpsest of rises and retreats, of rivers braiding and unbraiding, of deltas that move like thoughts across centuries, leaving behind silt thick, with memory that doesn't call itself by any name we know. We let entropy sit with us like an elder, not cruel, only thorough, reminding us that order loosens so new order can form, that loss and making are part of the same wheel, and in that turning wheel, isotopes keep time without drama, tiny metronomes in bone and peat and carbonate mud, ticking half-lives that stretch beyond our histories, impartial and strangely kind. Is it possible that when we look for ourselves too directly, we miss the angle where we might be seen best? the angle of side glance, where atmospheric change writes itself into trapped bubbles, where tree rings carry a long conversation between frost and fire, where lake beds lay down valves as thin as breath and as precise as a heartbeat. Not because we are central, but because we are momentary, and in being momentary we make a small shape the planet cannot help but include in its ongoing sentence. Maybe this is why silence matters. The sound of absence is not empty, it's a contour that lets other tones be heard, like the quiet between waves that teaches the ear what a wave is. We sit with that quiet, and with the idea that forgotten epochs are not gone so much as diffused, translated into forms we must learn to feel, a trace pigment in a mineral that shouldn't be there, a sudden smoothing in a curve of shells, a pothole in the graph of normal years, where a different rhythm briefly played. Could a future hand brush dust from our time, and find not a monument, but a shift in taste, the planet tasting slightly of us, like rain that remembers smoke? Maybe, maybe not. The more we lean in, the more the world leans back with its patient refusals, with its invitation to slow down and ask a kinder question, one that does not demand a shouted reply. And yet, if pages can be made of minerals and weather, and the long breath of oceans, if memory can survive as cadence when characters are gone, then it follows gently to wonder what kinds of ink we have never thought to check. What other registers of time, what other quiet instruments might be keeping score just out of sight, waiting for us to notice the pattern that begins where ordinary rock ends and something slightly impossible begins. Where ordinary rock ends and something slightly impossible begins, we slow our step and let our eyes adjust to a quieter kind of light, the light of minerals speaking softly, of textures that hold stories without letters, of time that does not pass so much as gather. We stay with the idea that memory could be layered, not because the past refuses to leave, but because matter prefers to rearrange rather than vanish, turning what was city into sand, what was sand into stone, what was stone into a folded mountain, whose pages can be read only by rain. We picture a shoreline under a grey morning, and how the sea edits with patience, not a single stroke, but a rhythm, push and pull, until straight lines lose their stiffness and become part of the coast's handwriting. Maybe a pier becomes pebbles, pebbles become silt, and silt, in a still lagoon, settles in lamina so fine that a fingertip could disturb a century, and yet a fingertip would not, because reverence knows when to be still. We listen for isotopes the way one listens for a faraway train at night, carbon and oxygen and nitrogen counting in their quiet way, not because they care for our meaning, but because decay keeps time even when we sleep. Could it be that in some narrow band of clay, a future reader will find a breath of altered ratios, a small departure from the usual song, the kind of dissonance that suggests a hand once touched the dial? We imagine that hand belonging to no single person, but to a species that learned to light ancient darkness and send its stored sunlight back into sky, changing the air's grammar for a while, not forever, but long enough to leave a faint accent that can be heard in ice or stalagmite or shell. Ocean floors carry such accents downhill, into trenches where basalt drinks old surface and forgets, and yet forgetting is not perfect. Some layers are peeled off and kept along the rising margins, welded into new land that we will someday call original, though it is a collage of moments. Perhaps a geologist on that land, in air that smells of wet lichen, will break a slate and hold it to the light, seeing a shimmer of pigments that don't quite belong, a green a touch too green, a red that wavers toward rusted memory, not because the past shouts but because it hums, and the hum is enough to raise questions that feel like tides traveling under skin. Fossils remind us that survival is often a translation, bone to calcite, wood to stone, presence to pattern, and we ask whether a circuit might one day become an ore, a polymer become a shale with an unfamiliar curve, a glass become a milky vein in quartz that tells not a story but a tempo. Maybe, maybe not. Entropy loosens what we tie, and yet it also distributes, spreading traces into vastness where they are harder to hear, but harder to erase, like a scent the wind cannot place, and will not fully release. We stand inside this patience and notice how climate keeps its long breath, inhaling ice, exhaling forest, then sometimes holding both at once in a brief confusion that leaves a mark that could be ours, or not, but always a reminder that the atmosphere is a living archive, thin as a thought, wide as the world. We think of stalactites taking dictation from dripping water, recording the dust of deserts and the salt of seas, the smoke of summers and the quiet of winters stacked in rings. So narrow a human life might be no more than a smudge, and yet a smudge still counts. Is it possible that our clearest trace is not an object but a cadence, a brief quickening in sediment, an odd syncopation in pollen, the way two distant records line up and nod to each other across an epoch? We rest in that possibility, letting it pass through us like a slow tide, not because we need to be found, but because it is kind to imagine the planet as a keeper of gentle receipts, little proofs that matter remembers in its own way. And as twilight gathers over basalt cliffs and the sea folds back the edges of day, we feel how the world prefers soft edges, and how even our certainties become rounded when we hold them long enough. Maybe a forgotten epoch is not an empty room but a dim one, where our eyes will adjust if we wait. Maybe the question is not how to prove, but how to listen. The surf writes, the wind edits, the rocks bind, and somewhere beneath our feet, plates negotiate with heat and time, turning pages we cannot turn by hand. And yet, if memory can hide in the chemistry of clay and the breathing of ice, if it can move between ocean and mountain without losing its pulse, what other traces might linger, not in stone at all but in living tissue, in rings and reefs, and the quiet architecture of shells, waiting for us to follow the beat into the bodies that learned the planet's song and kept a bar of it safe. Waiting for us to follow the beat into the bodies that learned the planet's song and kept a bar of it safe. We turn to living archives that do not speak in sentences but in growth, in rings that widen or tighten like breaths, in shells that stack calcium into poems the sea can read. We stand with trees that remember frost and fire in alternating widths, not because they wish to testify, but because water and light negotiate with time inside their trunks, laying down thin announcements of plenty and lean, of ash on the wind, of summers that came too quickly. We picture coral building cities from the chemistry of waves, each polyp a mason of temperature, of acidity, of the slightest drift in nutrients, and how their skeletons, bright while living, pale when gone, become a ledger of oceans changing, a slow script that records warmth, a pause, a worry, then wonder again. Could it be that within these living metronomes the echo of another cadence hides, a faint syncopation that does not match volcanic pulses or orbital rhythms, something that might be industry once removed, dissolved into food webs and reef stone, until it is nothing but a gentle inflection in the way calcite grows? Maybe, maybe not. We watch a leaf take carbon from air and fix it into sweetness, into tissue that will later fall, later rot, later join soil where microbes reassign the story, and we see how isotope trails pass hand to hand, oxygen speaking of rains from certain latitudes, hydrogen carrying the signature of ancient storms, carbon holding the weight of a choice to burn, then letting it go grain by grain, not because memory wants to stay, but because matter loves circles, loves returning by different roads. In caves, drip water keeps a beat over centuries, laying down layers in stalagmites that taste of forests above, of fields ploughed open, of uncut grass returning, of smoke that once travelled into limestone pores and slept there. These pillars are quiet lungs, inhaling trace elements, exhaling light when we hold a lamp close, and their rings blur like the edges of dreams, precise but patient. We imagine a future hand holding a core of ice, and inside it bubbles of air that once brushed the faces of beings like us or not like us at all, air that learned a new mixture for a time, and then loosened back, leaving a slope on a graph that is soft to the eye, but undeniable to the touch, the way a scar is undeniable even when it is pale. And while oceans carry old flaws downward, unspooling seamounts into heat where identity liquefies. Some shelves keep their quiet ledgers safe, buried beneath silt that arrives like snowfall without winter, a steady lullaby of grains that trap pollen, soot, plankton shells fragile as breath. If there was a season when the sky held more of what fires make, would these thin pages catch it? Could it be that fish bones, light as they are, record a whisper of digested metal, a trace of altered nitrogen that marks an age of fertilizer and fever, then fades as rivers relearn a slower pace? We let these questions move through us without asking them to sit still. Entropy moves through bodies too, softening what we call permanent into what the planet calls useful, and there is a mercy in that. A mercy that takes monuments down to minerals that plants can drink, that reefs can borrow, that sand can fold into dunes which walk the desert like patient animals. We walk beside that mercy, and in its shade the idea of lost civilizations becomes less like a wound and more like a tide, a going and returning that leaves behind different shells each time. If there were hands before ours, perhaps their trace is carried now in a lineage of plankton that learned to bloom by a slightly different light, or in a forest whose seeds remember a wind that blew strange for a century. Perhaps, perhaps not. The atmosphere keeps editing the world above, and the cells keep editing the world within, and somewhere between those two scripts a chorus forms, not loud, not pleading, only steady. This is how the planet writes, through leaves and limestone, through cartilage and clay, through repetition that becomes meaning because it repeats. We rest with that steadiness and feel our own breathing join it. Slower now, tuned to a clock without numbers, and in that tuning we sense how identity itself is porous, how self becomes soil, soil becomes grass, grass becomes bone, bone becomes carbonate, and somewhere in that long chain a thought appears. If living bodies can carry signals across centuries, then memory is not only rock-bound, it is blood-bound, sap-bound, tide-bound, learning to move so it can last. And yet, if life can archive the planet, and the planet can archive life, what happens when memory moves into material we made? What does clay remember when it meets our chemistry? What does sand say when it becomes glass and then sand again? What quiet testimonies might technofossils give when they settle among shells and begin to learn the sea's slow grammar? What quiet testimonies might technofossils give when they settle among shells and begin to learn the sea's slow grammar? We ask, and we let the question rest like a pebble in the mouth of the tide, turned and turned until its edges forget they were ever sharp. We imagine a shard of polymer sinking through green light, not because it is heavy, but because time is heavier, and time prefers the seafloor where snow falls upward from the continents, dust, diatoms, soot, the small calcium houses of lives too brief to name. Maybe that shard becomes raft and reef at once, a place where microbes test new appetites, where salt nudges chains to fray, where sunlight and waves conspire to make the durable delicate and the delicate lasting. Maybe, maybe not. In the hush between swells, we picture grains of fly ash and copper, bright as old coins mingling with foraminifera, their spiral shells keeping the season's temperature like a diary written in oxygen's two voices, heavy and light. And we wonder if a future hand reading those ratios will hear a small quickening, a breath taken too fast and held too long. Not because the ocean cares for our years, but because water keeps accounts we cannot close, passing imbalance along currents into gyres, across trenches, always moving, always settling. We follow the fragment downward to the sediment's quiet theatre, where layers are laid as thin as the skin of sleep, and each layer receives what the day could not carry anymore, a leaf ghost light as thought, a needle of glass, a pulse of soot, the pale dust of a distant drought, arriving like a letter that took the long way home. Could it be that within these pages, a new mineral begins to grow around what we made, concentric and patient, a concretion learning the curve of a bottle cap, the hint of a circuit, until the original softens and the mineral remains, an imprint with no need for explanation. We do not force it to speak, We only listen to the chemistry as it rearranges, iron borrowing oxygen and turning the water rusty as a memory, sulfur making shy agreements in dark places, carbon deciding which company to keep. Above all this, the long conveyor of the world moves so slowly, it feels like rest, old ocean floor tilting toward heat, basalt reheated like an old idea, and yet margins crumple and shave, saving scraps that will someday be mountains, storing layers that might carry a whisper through the furnace by simply refusing to go under. Perhaps a ridge of future stone will bear our accent in a faint seam of pigments that do not match the parent rock, a small disagreement baked into the fold, a quiet no inside a larger yes. Entropy stands beside us like a patient teacher who erases half the board each day and finds that the lesson still continues, not because the words persist, but because the habit of writing does. We walk a beach where glass has become frosted sugar, where steel has taken on the color of dried blood, where a bead of blue rolls from wave to wave as if learning how to be a pebble, and we understand that decay is not failure, it is an invitation to change shape, to keep belonging. If an elder civilization once softened into this same grammar, would its polymers now be clay with unfamiliar habits, its alloys a vein that smudges the magnet, its fuels a brief warmth remembered in calcite and ice? Is it possible that a volcano roaring its old indifferent fire once glazed a midden of strange ceramics into a new rock that waits, patient as an unopened book, for a geologist's hammer to rhyme with it? We do not insist. We wonder. We let repetition do its work, not because repetition is dull, but because the planet writes in refrains. The tide returns, the plates return, the winters return, and within these returns small deviations carry meaning like lanterns that do not go out. Far from shore, the atmosphere keeps its thin archive in ice and cloud and pore, and there, too, technofossils may leave their soft fingerprints, a drift of halogens caught in snow that took decades to fall, a curve that bends where it should have arched, a season that learned a new color. We imagine a stalagmite miles inland tasting aerosols that rode the wind from fires that were not only trees, tasting a century as a faint bitterness, then tasting silence, then tasting rain that forgot the smoke. Maybe the clean return is incomplete, the way a healed bone still knows the weather, and in that ache a reader of stone might find our error by feel more than by sight. Maybe, maybe not. Loss does not empty the world, it refines its echoes, and those echoes choose hosts. We rarely expect a fish earbone carrying trace metals like footnotes, a peat bog sipping and saving the breath of summers, a dune learning the grit of distant cities and singing their quiet names when the wind is right. Night gathers without urgency, and sand cools, and under the dark the long arithmetic continues. Polymers to crumbs, crumbs to films, films to flakes, folded into mud where pressure will ask them to choose again, stay soft or learn a crystalline tongue. We picture a thin section of future rock under polarizing light, mineral colors rotating like sleepy planets, and at the edge, a ribbon that behaves almost but not quite like clay, and almost that draws the eye the way a whisper draws the ear. What if the clearest sign is this almost? The subtle mismatch, the seam that refuses to settle into the usual, the hue that drifts a single shade too far. What if the most human trace is our habit of making edges, and time's habit is to round them, and what remains is a compromise that looks, from a distance, like ordinary stone? We give thanks for ordinary stone. It is the gentlest witness, steady, forgiving, willing to be ground to sand and built again without complaint. And yet, if the seabed can tutor our inventions into minerals, if trenches can forget and margins can remember, then somewhere above the waves, in the thin pages of air and cloud, other signals may be keeping watch too, faint lights in the chemistry of the sky, small changes that drift like constellations made of gases, asking us to look up and read what the atmosphere has been quietly writing all along. Asking us to look up and read what the atmosphere has been quietly writing all along. We lift our gaze and let the sky become a slow book, its pages turned by winds we cannot see, but can feel in the way leaves answer, in the way birds tilt their wings to ride a sentence that stretches from horizon to horizon. We imagine the air as a thin memory palace, not because it keeps everything, but because it forgets with a rhythm, letting certain traces linger long enough to teach us their names. Carbon made slightly heavier by the way we burned ancient sunlight and sent it back as breath. Nitrogen shifted by fields that grew fast and bright, halogens that do not belong to thunderheads yet found their way into snow that fell for 100 winters in a patient spiral. Maybe, maybe not. We close our eyes and picture ice as the sky's handwriting, bubbles sealed like punctuation from evenings long gone, commas of oxygen and exclamation points of methane. Each trapped syllable a report from seasons that learned a different pace and then returned, almost to normal, but not quite. Not because the world is broken, but because change lays down its own sediment in air, thin as a veil, real as a pulse. We stand on high ground where the wind tastes of salt and pine and far-off rain, and we consider how isotopes behave like shy messengers, preferring balance but confessing disturbance when pushed. Carbon 13 leaning a fraction, oxygen 18 hinting at warmth, argon and krypton whispering about ice that slept for millennia before meeting the bright sting of a drill. Could it be that an older civilization, if it breathed hard for a while, left a shallow fingerprint pressed into the sky's long ledger, one that tides and trees eventually softened, until only the most careful listening could hear the residual hush? We do not rush the thought. We let it settle like evening light on a lake, spreading thin, mirroring clouds that pass without wanting to be caught. The stratosphere moves in waves that do not sing but hum, and in that hum volcanic notes arrive with ash and sulfur, quick and obvious, while the notes of industry arrive as patience, as accumulation, as a gentle nudge that becomes a leaning. Maybe the leaning is enough to realign storm tracks so slightly that river deltas start a new paragraph, enough to ask glaciers to thin their edges not in panic, but in a slow release that reshapes the map with the courtesy of centuries. In the lowlands, fog drifts like a kind of amnesia that is kind to faces, and we think about how memory in air is different from memory in stone. It circulates, it mingles, it changes partners at every dance, and yet it can be archived by the world's cold places, by the pores of ancient snow, by the varnish that deserts paint on rocks when dust and dew agree to work together. Is it possible that this varnish, atom by atom, gathered traces of ages when fires were common and metals were restless, preserving a chemistry of proximity rather than intention, a map made of the tiniest decisions? We listen for that map in ringed trunks that drink the sky and fix it into wood, in peat that sips the exhalations of summers and stores them in a library of brown pages that do not mold because time there has learned to move like a tortoise. Not because life resists forgetting, but because life prefers to keep useful patterns close, passing them from leaf to root, from root to soil, from soil to air, again, a generous circle where nothing is truly the same and nothing is truly lost. High above, where air thins and the blue deepens, the planet's shield cracks into ribbons of light during storms of spaceborne dust, and even there the chemistry shifts, not loudly, only enough to tint the pages for a season or two. A footnote the sky writes to itself. We imagine a future reader who holds a cylinder of ancient air to the light and watches it silver like a small moon in glass, and we wonder what they would think of our era's curve, sharp to us, perhaps merely a flourish to them, a fast brushstroke on a mural painted in orbits and tilts. Maybe they will find another flourish earlier on, humble and narrow, and ask the same question we ask now, what if, and then the rest trails off, because the answer is not a name but a cadence. We breathe with that cadence, long and slow, and feel our own exhale join the archive that the wind will fold and unfold across ridges, into valleys, over sleeping towns where chimneys remember winter stories in their bricks. Night pulls a quiet blanket over the troposphere, but the accounting does not stop. Reactions continue in the dark, ozone stitching and unstitching like a patient seamstress, radicals pairing off, water building, halos around particles that were once smoke and are now seeds of cloud. Could it be that some of those seeds began in unfamiliar fires, in kilns that sought color, in engines that learned speed, and that their descendants still drift, not as guilt, only as trace, a family of motes that know the way into thunderheads and back out as rain? Maybe, maybe not. The gentleness of uncertainty rocks us like a small boat on a long swell, and in that rocking we allow a bolder thought to surface without waves. If the sky can keep a whisper of us, and still make room for dawn, then the measure of our presence is not only in magnitude, but in manners, in how softly we learn to speak within a chamber that carries every word. We turn from cloud to horizon, and find the seam where air meets water, the place where reflections begin to translate one archive into another, and the sea accepts the sky's deliveries, with its usual courtesy, dissolving, buffering, breathing them into its own circulation. And yet, if the atmosphere can hold a story in bubbles and varnish and rings, what else might keep the lines we miss? What pages lie below our feet where pressure writes with heat, where stone, not air, remembers by changing its name? What pages lie below our feet where pressure writes with heat, where stone, not air, remembers by changing its name? We step gently into that deeper library where shelves tilt and fold, and every book is a mountain turned slowly inward toward its own first thought. We picture sediments laid down like sleepy breaths, silt, clay, ash, each layer a pause between storms, and then with time's steady hand, those pauses press together until spaces close and minerals reorganize, not because they wish to, but because atoms prefer company that fits tighter at depth. Shale becomes slate, slate becomes phyllite with a faint sheen like moonlight caught in rock, and if the journey continues, mica blooms into schist, then gneiss arranges itself into light and dark bands, a barcode for the pressures the crust has felt. Could it be that in these transformations, a memory survives as texture rather than text, an old shoreline retold as a line of quartz, a buried swamp retold as coal's shadow folded into a ridge? Maybe, maybe not. We lean our ear to the ground the way one listens at a door, and the door is a fault, and behind it the page has been jolted, lifted, slid, torn, and then healed in mineral stitches that do not match the original grain but hold anyway, like careful scars. We follow a piece of ancient seabed inward, subducted under a continent like a ribbon drawn beneath cloth, and there water-locked in minerals is released, a quiet unbuttoning that lowers the melting point of mantle rocks so that magma can form, a reminder that even at depth, what is remembered can make something new. In that heat, organic matter forgets its softness and becomes graphite or a residue of carbon that drifts into veins with fluids rich in metals, and along those veins crystals arrive patient as frost, growing where pressure eases, where space appears, where the planet allows for geometry to happen. If there were traces of a different kind, pigments, alloys, polymers, they would need luck beyond our usual imagination to pass through this furnace, and yet luck does occur. Slices of ocean floor are scraped off instead of pulled down, pressed into accretionary prisms, lifted, tilted to daylight in some future range, where a geologist's hammer sounds like a bell and the split face of a rock shows a ripple that started as a ripple of water, not because the past refuses to be erased, but because erasure here often becomes palimpsest, and palimpsest is a form of devotion. In thin sections under polarizing light, we see colors that do not belong to the eye, but to the crystal. Interference rainbows that speak of lattice and stress, and in the midst of those rainbows a suture might appear, an intrusion, a vein, a seam that cooled slower or faster, that captured a different set of elements while the neighborhood was sleeping. Is it possible that some seams hold oddities the way a book's gutter holds a pressed leaf, a pigment particle that wandered, a grain with a shape too regular for chance, a tiny sphere like quenched lightning? We do not insist. We notice how pressure organizes randomness into foliation, how heat encourages recrystallization until histories blend, how entropy here is not a wandering apart, but a rearranging towards stability that still remembers the direction of squeeze. We run a hand along a cyst that glitters with mica and think of time as a sheen, a patina formed by metamorphism, by compression and release, by the slow choreography of atoms finding new partners in a dance that has no hurry and no end. Above these depths, mountains rise on isostatic rafts, then weather down as if exhaling stone into rivers that carry the story back to the sea. Erosion is not loss here, but circulation, a generous redistribution of detail so that what the core has learned the coast might also read in sand and silt and clay. Fossils caught in metamorphic halos blur at the edges, their identities softened into marbles even light, and yet their outlines sometimes persist just enough to be felt with a thumb like a memory told in low voice at dusk. Maybe a shell becomes a ghost in limestone. Maybe a reef becomes a cathedral of calcite that once held prayers of fish and now holds the slow echo of dripping water. Maybe coal turns to anthracite that burns clean and blue as if remembering sunlight more clearly. We ask quietly, what if transformation itself is the sign? What if the only durable truth is that names change while the cadence continues? Not because the earth is indifferent, but because its care is expressed in motion, in offering every structure another chance to belong. We walk along an outcrop where two histories meet, a basalt dike shouldering through pale sediments like ink drawn across a faded page, and at the margins, chet nodules have fractured into perfect curves, unshin skin layers that peel under a knife like the pages of a book that never learned to stop growing. Could it be that such margins are where we should listen hardest? Where old cold meets young heat, and the compromise becomes memorable, a silicate glass devitrified into spherulites, a contact aureole baked to a new hardness, a faint halo of magnetite aligning itself with an ancient field that pointed differently than ours. We imagine isotope trails frozen into minerals, lead stepping down its ladder inside zircon, argon building its patient count in feldspar, until a mountain is ready to tell us its age, and we accept that these clocks do not tick for us but can be read by us if we learn the script of their endings. Night comes even to rock faces, and under the dim light the grains look more alike, differences smoothing the way worries smooth when shared. We feel the crust's slow drift as a comfort, continental plates, moving like sleepers turning in a long bed, adjusting to stresses we cannot feel in a lifetime. Entropy here is a blanket, not a thief. Decay is a kindness that returns complexity to simplicity, so that new complexities can rise, so that metamorphism can proceed, so that minerals can keep telling their calm stories of pressure and temperature through index assemblages that behave like road signs in a fog. Maybe, maybe not. We accept the limits of what can be known and rest in the texture of what remains, the gleam of mica, the firmness of quartz, the dark weight of amphibole, each a note in a chord that plays beneath all our cities, beneath our questions, beneath our need to be remembered as more than a season. And yet, if stone can change its name and still keep the rhythm of its making, if mountains can fold yesterday into tomorrow and open it again, as valleys and sandbanks and clay, then the next page may not be buried at all, but scattered thin as dust, wide as a horizon, waiting for wind and water to gather it into patterns we might mistake for chance until we learn to see the grid that shouldn't be there, the straightness that argues with the river's will, the geometry that keeps returning like a half-remembered song. The geometry that keeps returning like a half-remembered song, we follow it with quiet curiosity, not because straight lines prove a story, but because rivers rarely choose them, dunes rarely keep them, and ice seldom lays them down without a reason older than our maps. We drift over floodplains at dusk, where oxbows glow like sleeping eyes, but between their curves, a faint rectitude shows itself, berms oddly parallel, levees too even for chance, a subtle chessboard revealed only when the sun lowers and the fields turn to bronze. Maybe they're natural, maybe they're not, And in that, maybe our attention softens enough to see patterns without forcing confessions. We picture silt stacking in rhythmic bars, valves counting winters in narrow strokes, pollen grains pinned like stars in lake mud, each one a letter from a season that passed gently. And then in a certain year the spacing changes, the dust darkens, the laminae thin, as if breath grew quicker, and then slower again, an arrhythmia in sediment that feels like intention, and could be nothing more than wind. Could it be that geometry is a kind of persistence test, the planet forever rounding what we sharpen, softening what we raise, but still letting some angles survive long enough to be found as textures rather than structures, as tendencies rather than walls? We think about how entropy, patient as rain, prefers curves because curves are the grammar of loss, and yet straightness reappears when energy is focused. Lava hardening in ruler-straight columns where cooling cracks choose neatness, ice breaking into leads that line the horizon like quiet roads in a white city, crystals schooling themselves into planes that meet at measured angles as if taught. Nature itself can make grids if the conditions ask for order, so the test is less the line than the story it sits inside. We let the eye drift to deserts where megadunes march like whales across a silent sea, and under the sand, radar finds former rivers that braided and unbraided for ages until, briefly, they straighten. Was that a fault tugging taut, a storm rearranging, or a hand guiding water toward a field that no longer exists? Maybe, maybe not. We do not name too quickly. We let the ground speak in delays. A terrace rises above a river with steps too evenly spaced to be only accident, cut by water, yes, but kept by someone who learned the river's temper and asked it to pause. Or perhaps frost heave and capillary clays conspired in repeating cells, a patterned ground with logic, cold and elegant as a night sky. From higher still, the coast draws lines with light where old piers once anchored boats, their pilings now reefs that hold fish and memory in equal measure, and between them longshore currents comb the sand into combs of their own, a new geometry drafted by wave period and wind. If a city once stood here, its right angles have been taken into the sea's handwriting, copied, slurred, and yet the echo lingers like a theme in a symphony that returns at unexpected moments. We imagine isotopes hitching rides in these patterns, carbon ratios slipping slightly in marsh grasses that follow abandoned canals, lead and copper lodged in floodplain clays that remember an upstream fever, and then a quiet convalescence. Not because elements can spell, but because chemistry keeps books in margins as well as in text. The air above reads the river below and writes it back as fog, as dew, as faint salt even inland, on mornings when the wind has a coastal memory. The system is busy with itself, everything listening to everything else, and in that chorus, straightness that shouldn't be there stands out like a sustained note. We kneel at the edge of a dry lake where the player cracks into polygons under heat, clean-edged, tempting to call artificial, but formed by shrinking and salt, by water leaving in an orderly way. Nature has her own drafting table, so we tread carefully. Still, beneath the surface clay, a layer of dark silt glitters with tiny spheres, industrial, volcanic, cosmic, and the microscope cannot comfort us into certainty. We hold one on a needle tip, and it shines like a miniature moon, a quenched droplet, telling of fire that met air and froze into perfection before it could remember why. Could it be that in some forgotten epoch similar beads rained through a sky that had other aims, that a city's breath became a brief meteor shower that never scorched, only settled into the patient arithmetic of basins? Maybe a chain of cores moved from heat to ash to water to clay, a sequence we know well because we have watched it in our own centuries, and in the clay the sequence is smoothed until intent looks like weather and weather looks like habit. Far away, a valley floor holds rectangles of brighter green each spring where snowmelt lingers just longer along buried walls that no longer rise, stones now earth, earth now loam. Plants read the subsurface, like touch readers of a raised script, their roots spelling out a geometry that returns each year, not loudly, not fully, but enough to catch the attentive eye from a hillside at evening. We think of permafrost as an archive that thaws and refreezes, drifting and yet preserving patterns of past warmth and cold, and within it sometimes wooden lines appear, roots or beams hard to say, while methane bubbles name the seasons with small repeating pops. Is it possible that geometry can hibernate, that a grid can sleep beneath muskeg and wake only in a drought when the surface tightens and the lost plan sighs through in ghostly squares? We do not chase it. We let it pass like a deer through tall grass, seen and then unseen, a rumor of straightness carried by light. At the shore again, tide pulls back to reveal an intertidal mosaic, old footings softened to reef nubs, ship ribs becoming eelgrass gardens, the mathematics of life taking our angles and rounding them into homes, and as we watch a flock lifts, turns, settles, drawing a living vector field on evening air, each bird a point in an equation solved by instinct. We breathe with them and feel how modest our lines are against the ocean's long handwriting, not because our work is small, but because the paper is vast and continues without us. Yet patterns recur, a causeway submerged, but still insisting on a straight stitch through the marsh. Beach ridges parallel as pages born of storm after storm, a buried road that channels groundwater and so grows willows in a ruler's path. Maybe these survivals are enough to hint at hands we will never hold. Maybe they are only the planet playing with rules it has always loved. Maybe not. Night smooths the landscape into gradients, and the grid dissolves with darkness, as if to remind us that straightness, like certainty, is a daylight habit. Under stars, dunes breathe, rivers murmur their lazy calculus, and plates drift with a grace that ignores rulers. If a lost geometry exists, it will have to cooperate with this breathing to remain, translating from stone to soil to plant to pattern, failing in one register, persisting in another, like a melody that can be carried by flute, or by water, or by wind. We accept the conditions, we accept the slowness, we accept the kindness of a world that rounds our corners, so it can keep moving, and in that acceptance, a new question arrives at the edge of sleep. If patterns can hide in plain sight as arrangement rather than artifact, then what else could be hiding as chemistry rather than shape, as ratios tucked into the finest particles, as whispers that clay has saved, as inks that only the smallest grains know how to read? As ratios tucked into the finest particles, as whispers that clay has saved, as inks that only the smallest grains know how to read, we lean closer to the ground and let our breaths slow until the soil's own tempo rises to meet it. A hush where minerals keep confidences not out of secrecy, but because silence is how time speaks here. We picture a thin smear of lake mud gathered year by year, pale in summer, dark in winter, and hidden within those delicate alternations, the faintest tilt of numbers, a carbon made a touch heavier by a season of fires that were more than forest, a nitrogen edged by the memory of fields that ran too bright, a sulfur softened after rains unlearned their acid, not because the earth prefers equations, but because energy always leaves a ledger, even when the ink is dust. We imagine clay plates, elite, smectite, kaolinite, stacked like tidy notebooks, their surfaces charged with welcome, holding ions the way a kind hand holds a story, loosely enough to pass it on, firmly enough that it does not fall apart, and we wonder if a polymer's ghost could arrive, as a trace monomer tucked between sheets, if a dye could present as a shy colorant bound to edges, if a strange catalyst could sleep for centuries and still bend a reaction by a breath. Maybe, maybe not. In the patient dark of pores, water moves like thought through capillaries we cannot see, carrying whispers from storm to storm, marrying ash to silt, folding soot into flock that drifts and lands, and every landing is a chance for memory to choose a mineral home. We turn the imagined sediment in cross-section gently, and the valves become a quiet film, where each frame is a year, and every second is a century. And even at this hush we notice anomalies that sit like hesitations in speech, metal spikes that do not match the volcanoes we know, a mercury sulk that lingers longer than fire alone can explain, a thin horizon of microbeads like punctuation shaken from an unseen sentence. Could it be that entropy, which loosens order into possibility, also arranges the smallest archive by favoring what sticks and what sinks, that the most durable records are not bones or ruins but imbalances, so slight they pass through cataclysm untouched? We do not claim it. We cradle the thought like a warm stone in a cool hand and watch, as isotopes keep their unhurried time, lead stepping down in zircons that fell as dust, argon accumulating in sanodyne shards invisible to the eye, oxygen's twin voices, heavy and light, braiding in shells and diatoms until temperature's lullaby can be read backwards. The longer we listen, the more chemistry sounds like weather slowed to a hum that remembers an atmosphere's mood, an ocean's taste, a continent's patience, without naming any of them. Along a river bend at low evening, silt settles in eddies shaped by roots and by forgotten embankments, and in that settling the water chooses what to keep and what to let go, teaching us that archive is also a verb, a gentle sorting that repeats until meaning appears as a pattern rather than a headline. Perhaps a future hand will take a core, and under light too soft to wake a moth, find a season where pollen skews towards species that favor warmth or city edges, and beside it a rising copper too, even for a storm, and too shy for a mine, and between them a soot signature with odd geometry, spheres that formed in a controlled burn rather than the wild irregularity of trees. Perhaps not. We accept that clay tells the truth in accents, in tonal shifts rather than proclamations, and we accept, too, that ocean subduction can steal entire chapters, sweeping shelves of mud into heat that translates evidence into new minerals, and yet even their scraps are saved where plates scrape and buckle, where melange gathers the world's loose threads and sews them into a tapestry set to rise as hills no one expects. Memory, then, is not an object but a choreography. Deposit, disturb, bury, lift, erode, repeat, each pass a chance to write thinner and somehow clearer, the way a pencil learns grace when the point is nearly gone. We breathe with this rhythm and feel how loss is not failure but function, how decay is not an ending but a method of editing that removes noise, so a signal can be small and still be heard by a careful ear. Is it possible that the clearest record of any civilization, first or last, will be no monument at all but a suite of tiny disagreements, ratios that lean, clays that hold unfamiliar guests, aerosols fossilized in ice like sighs caught mid-syllable? We let the idea rest and drift towards sleep inside it, counting not sheep but layers, the gentle algebra of valves, the murmured testimony of peat, the quiet arithmetic of stalagmites that taste clouds from eras without names. And yet, if these fine-grained inks can keep a story through floods and freezes and the long slide of seafloors, then the next page may ask us to widen our ear beyond chemistry altogether, to listen for a silence shaped by absence, the pauses in the fossil choir where a note is missing, the sudden thinning of shells, the way extinction edits a stanza and leaves a margin we cannot ignore. And leaves a margin we cannot ignore, a pale hush in the chorus where sound should be, a missing feather, a missing shell, a missing leaf shadow on the riverbed at noon. We sit with that silence not because we want alarm, but because absence is a kind of handwriting too, a negative script that deep time reads with respect. In rock, the quiet comes as a thinning of fossils, as a sudden boundary where diversity drops like a tide that never quite returns, and we trace that edge with a gloved finger, feeling how the sediment continues as if nothing changed, grains still settled, clays still layered, while life itself paused, edited, restarted in a different key. Could it be that an old civilization, if it ever shared this planet's breath, moved through such a pause, a silence shaped not by a single blow, but by many small leanings? Climate nudged, oceans warmed, acid crept into water like a soft rumor, oxygen sighed, And in that soft rumor, species that could not bend broke. Maybe, maybe not. We remember that extinction events are not always fireworks. Sometimes they are dimmers, slow hands on a slow switch, and their signatures live in chemistry as much as in bone. Carbon ratios that lean toward lightness or heaviness, sulfur that tells of anoxic seas, iridium that falls like starlight after a stone strikes, mercury that rides ash when continents burn. We imagine the boundary as a band we could hold, thin, dark, rich with the soot of forests, with the pollen of last summers, with the teeth of fish that knew different currents, and in that band the air itself is caught, bubbled in amber ice elsewhere, whispering of greenhouse swells and winters out of tune, not because the planet punishes, but because it recalibrates. Feedbacks seek balance the way water seeks level, and sometimes the seeking redraws the map. We think of ocean subduction carrying entire epochs downward, but before they go they leave copies, shells stored in limestone, isotopes locked in for aminifera, the shape of a crisis translated into carbonate that later rises as cliffs where swallows carve homes into the history of loss. Is it possible that extinction is an editor that prefers brevity in the middle of long books, a clearing of the stage so the next act can find room, a thinning of branches so the light can reach a seed that had forgotten the sun? We do not romanticize it, we acknowledge the ache, the real vanishing, the names we will never know, and we lie down beside that ache, as one lies beside a sleeping child, careful not to wake it, careful not to look away. Entropy moves through these pages not as a vandal, but as a librarian who reshelves what cannot be read anymore, making space, making order that is not ours, and in that order the fossil record breathes again, first sparse, then busy, then sparse, like lungs learning a different altitude. We hold a trilobite in one palm, and a modern shell in the other, and feel how continuity hides inside difference, how identity survives as pattern more than as face, and then our mind turns to the breaks, to the places where pattern fails, to the gaps that teach us as much as any bone. An abrupt drop in reef builders when the ocean grew sour, a thinning of large mammals when climates shifted too quickly, a lull in pollen where fires ran like rumors through dry years that refused to end. Could it be that some lulls were shaped not only by volcanism or by rock from the sky, but by hands that lit ancient carbon and taught it to fly, hands that moved rivers and kept them from their floodplains, hands that did not know how loud their quiet could be? Maybe, maybe not. The humility we carry is our rudder. It keeps us from crashing our questions into the shore of certainty. We watch a cliff at evening where a thin ash layer glints among browns and reds, and we think of moments when the atmosphere met stone with heat enough to write in glass, tektites scattered like small moons, shocked quartz ticking like hidden clocks. Those are loud pages, easy to underline, but the long pauses, the ones written in a steady drizzle of altered plankton in the lingering breath of warm seas, ask us to read slower, to trace oxygen 18 and carbon 13 curves, like a finger along a pulse at rest. Not because numbers will cure our doubt, but because doubt deserves good instruments. We listen to reefs that calcified less when waters warmed, to caves that recorded droughts with wider rings, to peat that darkened as the air held more of what fires make, and we let their testimony collect in us like dew, small, cool, unarguable. A mass extinction is a threshold, and thresholds are tender. They bruise easily, they remember footsteps, they magnify small choices into long echoes. Is it possible that we are walking such a threshold now, and that others, if they existed, felt the same hush, the same sense that history had learned a new verb? Night draws over the valley, and the silhouettes of fossil cliffs turn to gentle shapes, and with the dark comes a steadier breath. The planet's heart beats along, and under that length our own worries thin and soften. We picture plates continuing their patient negotiations, river mouths tasting the moon's pull, winds moving heat from crowded places to empty ones, and we allow the thought that extinction, for all its grief, is also a kind of space-making, a pause between chords, a silence in which life relearns its scales. Maybe the silence is not empty but full of potential. Seed banks sleeping in cold ground, eggs waiting beneath dry mud, microbes holding blueprints no one has asked for yet. Maybe, maybe not. We are held by the kindness of uncertainty again, and in that kindness we ask our next small, necessary question, the one that turns the page without tearing it. If a pause can be so complete that even stone hears it, then what follows such a quiet? When the record begins to speak again, what first words does the planet choose? And could those words include a memory of us, faint but present, folded into the new chorus like a note that knows it once was missing? And could those words include a memory of us, faint but present, folded into the new chorus like a note that knows it once was missing? We listen for rhythm more than for meaning, for the way the planet sets tempo after a pause, for the slow return of seasons learning their steps again. We think of climate as a musician relearning an old song by ear, not because notes are written anywhere, but because cycles find themselves by moving orbital tilts leaning in and out, ocean currents switching lanes, winds tracing patient loops that carry heat from crowded latitudes to colder rooms at the edge of the map. Maybe the first words are not words at all, but the soft reappearance of snowlines at familiar heights, the careful rebuilding of ice that sighs as it settles, the lengthening of summers that stop just short of excess, the shortening of winters that remember restraint. Maybe, maybe not. We picture lakes laying down their thin annual pages, light, then dark, then light, and in those valves a new cadence emerges, where the lines even out, the soot thins, the pollen broadens from a few hardy species to acquire again, as if breath deepens after being held too long. We walk through a valley where glacier tongues once reached, and have since retired to higher bowls, their meltwater now teaching the river a calmer grammar, sandbars less skittish, banks rethreaded with willow and reed, and yet the land still carries the memory of the fever in its bones, a subtle subsidence here, a slump there, frost lines deeper than before, permafrost relearning how to stay. Is it possible that the atmosphere remembers in the gentle tilt of its ratios, carbon easing toward a balance, not because history is erased, but because new forests have begun to speak again, their green sentences absorbing, their roots editing, their fungal partnerships trading in quiet currencies beneath our feet? We imagine isotopes as old clocks reset by gradual choice, oxygen 18 in raindrops, shifting as storms find older tracks, deuterium whispering of colder cloud tops, argon trapped again in ice, that thickens ring by ring, not hurried, not stalled, just steady. The patience of it soothes us in the same way tide soothes stone, not because nothing changes, but because change returns to a curve we can rest inside. Along coasts, the sea lifts and lowers its shoulder against the land, with a touch that becomes familiar once more. Storm surges gentler, salt marshes rebuilding their layered quilts of peat, each blade of grass sifting silt from water until a new page lies smooth, and under that page, small crabs and worms stitch air into mud so roots can breathe and the archive can continue. We think of entropy here not as the dissolver but as the gardener's hand, breaking clods for seeds, mixing leftovers into soil, making room for order that isn't brittle, for patterns that bend instead of snap. Could it be that after every climatic sharpness there comes a wide vowel of time, where ecosystems practice, forgetting the shock by learning new habits, remembering resilience by imitation rather than by recollection? We let that notion drift like pollen over a meadow where insects resume their soft arithmetic, where birds test the columns of air for lift, where dawn light re-enters the leaves with a confidence that does not hurry. Maybe the sky keeps a thin nostalgia in its blue, a trace of past warmth that shows in afternoon haze. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, evenings lengthen in a way that feels earned. From the mountains, katabatic winds slide into basins like cool fingers across a sleeping brow, and in their passage they collect the day's small stories, the dust of distant fields less metallic than it was, the smoke of controlled flames that feed rather than devour, the salt that rides in calmer measure over dunes stitched by grass. The long conveyor of the ocean hums beneath all of this, overturning waters like a great lung, drawing down surface memory into depths where it will be kept, diluted, mixed, and eventually returned, altered but not erased. We imagine a future ice core drilled through the centuries to come, and in it a slope that flattens, a curve that softens, a record that says, without triumph and without sorrow, the system found its balance again, not because balance is guaranteed, but because feedbacks can be stubborn in their kindness, the way clouds form over warmer water to shade it, the way forests invite their own rains, the way snow brightens and sends heat back to the sky, as if offering a quiet apology. We do not expect perfection. We listen for moderation, for the way the planet speaks in middles after living at edges. At night, the desert cools quickly and radiates its heat to stars that do not answer. And in that release we hear a lesson about memory's weight. What is not needed can be set down. What is needed can be carried without strain if carried together. The stones click softly as they shrink in chill. The sand sighs down slip faces. The air grows clear enough to taste of nothing in particular, and nothing in particular is a kindness. Maybe our trace remains as a pale seam in cave rings, as a slightly odd layer in peat, as a handful of microbeads in a lake that learn to forget their names. Maybe our trace is smaller than we fear and larger than we hope, spread thin like a rumor that becomes a proverb no one remembers how to attribute. Is it possible that what follows us will not be a monument, nor a scar, but a caution shaped like comfort, a reminder that systems heal best when given time and room and quiet? We rest with that thought, letting the evidence arrange itself like stars, some bright, some barely there, all part of a picture that only appears when we stop trying to force it. In the morning that belongs to some later age, frost will lace a meadow and loosen by degrees, a river will place its gravel exactly where it must, a cliff will shed a sheet of rock and feed a talus that feeds a soil that feeds a birch whose leaves count summers with a steady hand. And yet, if climates can relearn their song after discord, if the air can soften its accent and the sea can keep secrets without sinking the truth, then perhaps the next question waits below this temperate surface. What happens to the traces that do not bend with weather at all, the ones forged in heat and pressure and folded into the crust? What of the pages that rise only when mountains speak? What of the pages that rise only when mountains speak? We wait for daylight to thin along a ridge, and in that soft unveiling a cliff opens like a slow book. Bands of sandstone and shale and ash reading themselves to the valley with the calm of something that has nothing left to prove. We let our eyes trace the bedding plains where rivers once braided and then forgot their names, where flood pulses laid coarse grit in one season and silk-fine mud in the next, and in the alternation a rhythm appears that does not hurry, a geologic breathing in which time is measured not in years, but in the patience of layers becoming weight. Maybe a seam of coal glows dull in shadow, an old swamp compressed into black syllables that catch a fingernail. Maybe a pale limestone holds the faint relief of shells that learn to be stone by trading molecule for molecule, identity for lattice, life for permanence. We hold the thought gently that each stratum is an old decision the planet chose and then chose again, not because it wanted to remember, but because the only way to move forward here is to keep writing down the same truths until they turn into rock. We follow a fault line where the wall has stepped, where strata that should meet do not, offset by meters as if a sentence lost its place and resumed a line too high. In the brokenness there is honesty. Is it possible that a buried page bearing the trace of a fever, carbon curves leaned, pollen narrowed, dust darkened, could ride this fracture upward, past the quiet of deeper beds and into light that erodes it free, so a future palm could weigh it and feel a season that strained to keep its balance? We picture minerals growing like careful stitchwork along the crack, calcite sealing water's path, quartz prisms aligning to stress that relieves in slow increments, and caught within those prisms, tiny bubbles of ancient air trapped like vowels from a lapsed tongue, a microarchive that does not translate but still speaks. Maybe, maybe not. Entropy seems absent here among the solid faces and crisp joints, and yet it is present as the wind that takes a micrometer at a time, as frost that finds a hairline and teaches it to widen, as lichen that writes green patience across a granite that thought it knew the meaning of long. On a ledge we sit beside a boulder of schist that glints with mica, its platy sheen a record of pressure that combed minerals into alignment, the crust's fingers smoothing once random grains into foliation. We think of ocean subduction far beneath us, plates slipping under plates like pages tucked to make room for more words, water released at depth, lowering the melting point of mantle rocks, birthing magmas that rise as sweat through cracks, cooling into veins and sills that lace the mountain like new notes added to an old score. If there were artifacts of other hands here, they would need to have learned the mountain's grammar to survive, softened to ore, remade as pigment in a metamorphic halo, translated into a crystalline habit that only slightly disobeys expectation. We do not expect to find them, we ask whether we would recognize them if we did. Could a panel of glass become chalcedony with a memory of its smooth insistence? Could copper wiring re-enter the world as malachite seams that tinge a valley's springs? Could polymers, chastened by heat, become a shale that splits with a different scent? The sun moves and the cliff seems to rotate, revealing crossbeds that froze a dune mid-step, foresets sloping like the backs of sleeping animals toward a wind that no longer blows between them. Thin drapes of finer dust fold like curtains in a theater that remembers each performance by the fall of its fabric. We slide a fingertip along the laminae, and it catches slightly on a surface hardened by a brief flood rich in clay. Small differences accumulate into stories here. Isotope trails flow through these textures like melodies below hearing. Oxygen manna, 18 in carbonate whispers about the temperature of a sea that varnished these grains. Strontium ratios nod toward the age of a continent, ground down to feed that sea. Carbon tells whether the life that lent its skeletons grew under skies, generous or sparse. We are not reading a list. We are listening to a cadence that repeats and varies, until meaning becomes feel, and feel becomes humility. Around a corner, a dike of basalt cuts cleanly through softer rock, black against buff, a single stroke of cooled fire that ignores the bedding and insists on its own direction. Contact zones on either side shine with new minerals like glaze. Could it be that some memories only become legible at these junctions, where heat argues with sediment, where order yields to intrusion, where the archive is interrupted and then healed with a scar, tough enough to last longer than the wound? We take comfort in the discipline of such places, chilled margins, columnar joints, vesicles like a breath held and then released as the molten became the solid. Not because we love certainty, but because certainty, briefly, allows wonder to rest without questioning itself. And still, at the edge of the flow, a pebble of older rock sits embedded, carried along and preserved intact, the past held within the new, as if to say nothing is completely swallowed. Something always rides through. Evening finds us on a talus slope, where broken pieces collect in angles and shadows, a moving mountain at the slowest speed, gravity's handwriting in a language we recognize immediately with our bodies. We feel how every fracture frees a face for weather to read, how every fall makes a surface that welcomes lichen, how every lichen seeds soil that invites a root, and how every root pries tenderly until the cliff breathes again as forest. Maybe this is the deepest kindness of decay, that it gives back vertical to horizontal, private to common, monument to meadow. Maybe not. The wind lifts, cool from snowfields, and we can smell the ice, though we cannot see it, an aroma like a clear thought, clean, sparse, unadorned, and in that breath we understand why mountains are places where memory is both buried and returned, stolen and gifted, edited and sung. Night gathers, and the faces of rock become silhouettes that lean into the sky, the ridge a slow pulse against stars, We lie back on warm stone cooling into the air and feel the day leave the rock as surely as ancient heat once left a magma, a transfer so gentle it could lull the hardest worries. The mountain is not telling us a conclusion. It is offering a pace, a way of holding questions that do not bruise when we carry them long. And yet, if some pages rise only when mountains speak, if uplift is a kind of remembering and erosion a kind of reading, what of the words that never harden at all, the signals that travel as light across darkness, the echoes that return without weight, the techno-signatures that may pass overhead, like faint constellations of intention? What if the next archive waits, not in stone, but in the sky's quiet circuits of night? What if the next archive waits, not in stone, but in the sky's quiet circuits of night? We lift our eyes and let darkness become a gentle instrument, a field where small lights practice their long patience, where distance is measured not in steps, but in the time it takes light to arrive with a message it did not forget. We think of the atmosphere as a veil, and the cosmos as the room beyond, and in that room, signals move the way rivers do, seeking paths of least resistance, bending around gravity's slow hands, dilated by speed and stretched thin by time, until intention looks like weather, and weather looks like intention. Maybe a lost civilization, if it had learned to lean on the night, would leave techno-signatures faint as dust but systematic, a thermostat, nudging a planet's infrared profile, a constellation sharpened by power, beamed between ground and orbit, a ring of objects humming in velocities that hint at purpose. Maybe, maybe not. We breathe and let uncertainty cradle us, because wonder does not need proof to be kind, and kindness does not need volume to be felt. We picture the Earth's limb from space, that blue arc where air turns thin and stars emerge, and along that edge satellites blink like cautious fish along a reef, their orbits layered into highways that circle without ever arriving, their decay a slow rain of metal atoms that join auroras in the high atmosphere, and then fall silent into seas that keep secrets. Not because absence is punishment, but because entropy is employment. Everything works at changing into something else, even our machines. Could it be that some of those paths, long gone dark, will still trace their geometry in trapped particles, in belts and plumes that remember how energy once moved through the magnetic field, like a harp string finding its note? The sky archives differently than rock. It keeps shape as motion and motion as habit, and habit as a background hum that becomes noticeable only when it changes. And change can mean a cycle learned, a pulse repeated, a light that never quite returns to zero. We imagine radio drifting like a tide across gulfs we cannot pronounce, a decades-long whisper that expands until its own strength becomes its silence. And we wonder whether, if others once spoke, their voices are now a cold, thin ghost stretched through space, measurable as faint static against the louder noise of stars birthing stars. A techno-signature could also be absence, a slice of starlight missing because a swarm of mirrors sips it and warms a world to comfort, or because dust arranged by intention shades a climate without leaving the scars of fire. Is it possible that sky archives are edits more than entries, subtractions that shape a planet's story by not letting certain extremes arrive? We consider our own airglow, the faint green and red that wave like sleep over deserts at midnight, and ask if a patient watcher ages hence might notice a season when the glow brightened. Where cities once worked hard at night, the faintest lace of photons woven by electrons that cascaded through machines and back into dark. On the ground, we sit by a quiet lake that mirrors the sky, and the reflection feels like a prayer answered in the language of water, a double night, one above, one below, both deep and easily disturbed. A meteor writes a line that ends in steam, a short sentence we can understand: heat, air, light, gone. If a civilization learned to hide its heat, to distribute it thinly, to place its energies where wind would carry them invisibly into seasonal noise, would it also teach the lake to forget, the ice to remember only winter, the tree rings to widen and narrow for reasons older than invention? Maybe, maybe not. The humility of such thoughts slows the heart and unclenches the need to be found. We begin to see how light can be gentle and still honest, how starlight can cross the dark without waking what sleeps, how moonlight can reveal bone-white stones without judging the blackness between them. We turn to the faintest measures, spectra, where absorption lines sit like fence posts across a field of colors, and in those lines molecules declare themselves with shy certainty: water, oxygen, methane, carbon dioxide, each a syllable in a planet's pronunciation of life. Could a buried epoch have altered that pronunciation, increased the consonants of combustion, softened the vowels of cold, left a lingering accent that took centuries to fade? The record would be thin, a few parts per million remembered in ice and cave and silt, a few tenths of a degree read by corals and forams and pine needles as they wrote their narrow script. The night sky would have noticed in the way Earth's long-wave glow shifted its balance, a slight leaning toward warmth that telescopes could have read from far away, and guessed at stories we only now tell ourselves. Not because we are exceptional, but because physics is fair, energy in, energy out, and every deviation is a note in the ledger. Somewhere beyond, galaxies turn like slow clocks, and their corridors are paved with dust that forms stars that form calcium in bones and iron in blood. Even the idea of techno-signature belongs to that wider chemistry. One more way the universe converts patience into structure. We breathe, and the air is cool, and our breath leaves like a small nebula into which we vanish. If we could look back at Earth from a long distance, what would we see? A pale dot brightened by clouds that know their work, a seasonal flicker of green like a heartbeat seen through a shirt, a nighttime hem briefly embroidered by light that learns to dim out of tenderness for sleep. Is it possible that the kindest footprint is the one that finds its size and stops growing, the one that teaches the sky to relax into familiar rhythms even while it hosts our brief intelligence? Maybe the lesson of techno-signatures is not how to shout across light years, but how to be readable to ourselves, to learn from the sky what restraint looks like, to hold energy the way stars hold it, not all at once, but in steady radiance. The lake's surface settles. Even frogs decide against a final note. Overhead, a satellite passes slowly with no sound, a bead of bright that does not blink, a reminder that our inventions can move like planets when we ask them to, keeping time with gravity rather than with hurry. We feel the world spin in the slipping constellations and think about identity under motion. Who are we when first light returns after a long night? Who were they if they watched the same sky and wished to leave no scar? Our questions soften into sleep, and sleep into a trust that the universe is old enough to hold both silence and signal without losing either. And yet, if the night can keep the quiet record of intention, if orbits and spectra and faint heat can carry a memory across darkness, then the dawn invites us back to the ground with a gentler task, where the first sun touches soil. What small decisions could we make, so the earth itself becomes fluent in forgetting our harms, and fluent, too, in remembering our care? And where the first sun touches soil, what small decisions could we make, so the earth itself becomes fluent in forgetting our harms and fluent, too, in remembering our care? We kneel at the edge of a field that does not yet have a name, and watch light slip into dew, until every blade of grass becomes a lens for a quieter kind of future. We think about how memory in landscapes is written by flows, by water that lingers or leaves, by carbon that rests in roots or rushes into sky, by sediment that drifts as a rumor of hills worn to softness. And we wonder if stewardship is simply learning the grammar of these flows, not because we control them, but because we follow their verbs until our hands move with their patience. Maybe a river asked to meander returns favor in fertile arcs, storing floods as silt instead of shock. Maybe a forest left to age writes carbon into lignin, then soil, then dark, then deeper dark, a long sentence with no hurry and no applause. Maybe, maybe not. We place our palm on the ground and feel the low vibration of life at work, the knit of mycelium trading sugars for minerals, the slow stitch of clay and humus into crumbs that hold rain like memory holds breath. And we ask, what if care is as small as letting these stitches proceed without interruption, as modest as stepping aside, so the fabric can finish itself? We imagine a coast where dunes are taught to walk again, grass combing wind into structure, roots inviting sand to stay, reclaimed not by force, but by asking a boundary to be a boundary, once more, porous and moving and alive. Could it be that the most durable kindness is the one that cooperates with entropy, letting wood rot where rot feeds a wetland, letting beavers misplace a stream into a meadow that will store both water and time, letting tides breathe in and out of marshes that write carbon into peat, the color of old tea? We consider the isotope trails of tenderness, carbon-13, leaning towards soils that kept their promise, nitrogen losing its sharpness where rivers remember floodplains, oxygen-18 in lake shells, smoothing as shade returns and summers become less feverish. The planet reads these curves, not as credits, not as blame, but as breath finding a steady rhythm after a sprint. Not because we erase our trace, but because we learn to shape it into something that belongs, the way a shell learns to be coastline, the way basalt learns to be sand. In cities, we picture roofs turned to quiet prairies, their grasses holding stormwater like old friends, releasing it as politely as morning fog, walls that grow vines which temper heat, not with noise but with shade, streets that forget they were asked to be rivers and allow real rivers to resume their perfect laziness nearby. What if concrete chose to crumble on a schedule that feeds gravel back to land rather than fighting until it fails in anger? What if metals chose companions that corrode into harmless greens and reds, a choreography of oxidation that ends as pigment in new stone rather than poison in a well? We do not need purity, we need good endings. Perhaps our technofossils could be designed as invitations, polymers that choose clay when they tire of being themselves, alloys that prefer minerals common enough to be folded back into crust without leaving odd accents, glasses that unlearn transparency and join silica as sand with no grudge. Maybe, maybe not. The thought itself is a relief, like shade across a summer path. We listen for the ocean's opinion because it keeps one, quiet but firm. It wants shorelines able to flex, estuaries with patience, kelp forests that slow waves into rooms where fish can grow old. The sea does not ask for monuments. It asks for margins where life can sort itself without panic. Could it be that care here is as humble as taking our weight off the edges, lifting harbours up from subsiding fill, giving back flats to birds that spell the tide with their feet, letting reefs cool under clouds invited by forests inland, because everything speaks with everything, and distance is not a barrier but a bridge. We stand with this web like one stands with a sleeping child, quiet and alert, knowing that help is sometimes holding still. Our breath slows to match the tide's arithmetic. In, out, salt as metronome, moon as keeper. Not because calm solves what is difficult, but because calm widens the room where solutions can arrive. In the mountains, care looks like a trail that does not scar, like a fire that edits fuel without anger, like snow that lasts into a season that remembers how to be late. We picture charcoals layered thin in soil, a modest archive of burns that did more good than harm, teaching pines to speak their resin without screaming. We picture alpine meadows free of trampling just enough that their sponges stay sponges, sending water downhill in paragraphs rather than exclamations. Is it possible that the best evidence of us will be an absence of violence in the record, a century where mercury faltered, where lead quieted, where soot became seasonal again and not a habit? The graphs would not brag, they would soften. Valves would thicken with leaf litter that did not rush. Cave rings would round their edges under drips that carried only the taste of rain. Peat would stack the hours without interruption. Maybe the planet is asking for boring poems, and maybe boring is beautiful when it means stability, fidelity, the long kindness of averages returning to their slow heartbeat. We try the idea on our tongue, self-erasure, not as vanishing but as translation, as becoming landscape in ways that help it keep its own story. Not because we do not matter, but because we prefer to matter gently. We are not likely to be remembered for our declarations. We are likely to be remembered for our adjustments, a bend left in a river's will, a floodplain unpaved, a forest allowed to become cathedral dark where snow-bent trunks hold one another through winter. If memory must remain, let it be a fragrance rather than a stain, a slight enrichment of dark soils, a softening of summer smoke, a pattern of migratory paths unbroken, long enough that birds forget the detours. Could the future feel us as ease rather than as edge, as the difference between a frantic and a faithful season? Maybe, maybe not. The humility of this dream does not diminish it, it deepens it like water deepens when the wind stops. Night gathers, and with it the slow courage that comes when urgency lets go of our shoulders. Stars return without hurry, and their arrangement is as it was before we learned their names. We lie back and hear the small gravel settle under our weight, and notice how even this is a geology of trust, the ground making room, elastically, then holding us, then forgetting we were ever here. And yet, if care can be written into soil and water and air as lightly as sleep, if our presence can teach the planet a softer balance, then the next question waits just beyond the dark hedge of the field. When we walk away, when our words pass into dust, what subtle marks might remain in minerals themselves? What whispers of our restraint or our excess will crystals keep as they grow? And how will stone with its long memory answer back? And how will stone with its long memory answer back? We lean toward minerals the way one leans toward an elder, listening for meanings that arrive slowly and prefer texture to speech. In the dim light of a hand lens, crystals reveal their habits, quartz growing in sixfold patience, calcite cleaving like folded paper, feldspar clouding with exsolution when the temperature crosses a quiet boundary, not because rocks are dramatic, but because they keep promises to physics over spans that outweight our names. We imagine trace elements slipping into lattices the way a guest might take the corner chair, lithium in mica sheets, strontium in aragonite, rare earths tucked into apatite. And we ask whether our time could tilt those invitations, leaving a subtle accent in the way a crystal chooses its company. Maybe, maybe not. If soot seasons a glacier, if seawater carries a different sweetness of carbon for a century, if dust from far deserts rides winds newly ambitious, then tiny shifts in isotopes may write themselves into growth bands like fine rings in a shell, oxygen's heavy voice easing in warm years, carbon's ratios leaning under our brief arrangements, nitrogen's tone softening as fields learn restraint. Stone does not scold, it accommodates, and its accommodation becomes record. In caves, drip by measured drip, calcite lays down laminae thin as the edge of sleep, each band a frost or a flood, a drought or a generous run of rain, and within those bands, trapped waters hold micro-stories of surface life, acids breathed by soils, the quiet touch of leaves, the aftertaste of smoke when summers forgot to stop. Could it be that our gentlest efforts, streams given back their curves, fires tended in small cool mosaics, soils allowed to knit humus dark as night, will tune those bands toward roundness, evening the chemistry the way a lullaby evens the breath of a child? We do not pretend control, we practice collaboration, hearing how entropy loosens edges into soil, and how that soil in turn feeds stone its clarity. Under mountains, pressure teaches minerals to reassemble clay to mica, mica to schist, with a sheen like rain in moonlight, limestone to marble that blurs old bones into a single patience. If our trace enters here, it must learn new names, becoming pigment in a metamorphic halo, an uncommon shade in garnet, a whisper in zircon, whose clock keeps counting even as continents turn their pages. On the seafloor, where silt settles like patient snow, silica skeletons drift down to become chert, and carbonates learn to be chalk and then to be limestone cliffs that light will paint gold. Within those quiet precipitations, foraminifera keep temperatures in the geometry of their chambers and the heft of their oxygen. A ledger a fingertip cannot feel, but a mass spectrometer can sing. Is it possible that a century of warmer breath will widen a chamber just enough to be noticed by careful eyes ages hence? A tiny generosity that the ocean offered and then withdrew. Maybe our metals will choose the company of sulfides in black smokers and grow into brassy pyrites flecked with stories. Maybe our glasses will unremember transparency and slip back into silica, joining the slow cathedral of quartz with only the faintest residual hue. Not because forgetting is perfect, but because belonging is persuasive, and the crust is persuasive over long distances of time. A river stone turns in our hand, mottled, rounded, its sharp truths carried away by miles of patient argument. We sense that memory in minerals is a matter of angles, their keenness or their kindness, their willingness to break or to sing when struck. Feldspar's fractures map stress as honestly as wrinkles map laughter. Magnetite aligns with ancient fields and holds the direction of vanished poles like a compass, loyal to an absent north. Zircon shelters uranium and lets lead accumulate until the date ripens into clarity. We picture a future thin section under polarizing light, colors rotating like slow planets, and at the edge of a grain a zone appears, slightly richer in an odd trace, slightly poorer in another, and almost that makes a researcher pause and lean closer. Maybe, maybe not. The pause itself is intimacy, a small vow between question and stone. We will take our time. Entropy stands nearby, not as eraser but as editor, reminding crystals to anneal, to heal dislocations, to drift toward lower energy where stability keeps the music soft and continuous. And yet not all wounds close. Shock quartz holds its stars of strain from impacts that turn noon to glass. Tektites keep the memory of flight. Shatter cones in basement rock freeze the gesture of a blow the planet rarely endures. If we leave any such loud pages, they will be obvious. The quieter ones, the kind we hope for, will be textures of mercy, soils darker by choice, cave bands rounder by patience, river stones, less tired because floods return to meander. We are not promised legibility, only participation. Stone will answer back in its own meter, with cleavage and habit, with exsolution and overgrowth, with inclusions like commas reminding us to breathe between certainties. Evening leans across an outcrop, and minerals change mood in shadow. Feldspar's chalk warming to peach, quartz keeping its cool light as if it had stored a winter within. This is perception's lesson that memory depends on how softly we look. We consider self-erasure again, not as disappearance but as translation into forms the planet favors, into chemistries that ease rather than resist. Glass to sand, steel to ironstone, plastic to waxy clays that fungi learn to taste without harm. Could it be that stewardship at geological scale is choosing endings with good manners, designing for metamorphism, for weathering that yields nutrients instead of wounds, for artifacts that love to become aggregate? Maybe, maybe not. The thought passes through us like groundwater, clear and unhurried, leaving behind a coolness that feels like trust. Night settles, and with it a silence that minerals have always known, a long vowel in the planet's language where everything still moves, just very little at once. We rest a palm on warm rock, losing heat to star cold, and in that exchange we hear the slowest stories, the way a lattice breathes, the way a mountain sighs towards sand. And yet, if crystals can fold our choices into their growth, if caves and cliffs and seafloors can keep our accents in tones too small to shout, then the next quiet curiosity lifts its head, where absence replaces presence, where fossils thin and pause, where entire choirs drop out. What edits in stone tell of life's soft retreat? And how do we read the silences that extinction writes, without letting fear grow louder than the evidence? And how do we read the silences that extinction writes, without letting fear grow louder than the evidence? We begin by breathing with the rock, letting our pulse slow until the cliff's long sentence can be heard between words. In the spaces where fossils thin to suggestion and then to none, we learn that absence has textures. A limestone that once glittered with shells now grows plain for a span of inches. A shale that used to whisper fish becomes a hush of silt. A reef line that ran bright across a basin fades like chalk in rain, not because the planet forgot how to decorate, but because the conditions that carve abundance stepped back, rearranged, asked life to rest. Could it be that some pauses happen the way dusk happens, gradually, gently, until night is there, and only afterward do we notice the last bird sang earlier than usual, the last insect drifted off before dark? Maybe, maybe not. We touch the boundary the way one touches a sleeping shoulder, careful and kind, and chemistry answers in a voice that does not tremble, carbon ratios leaning light where plants faltered, sulfur speaking of seas that lost their breath, Mercury naming burns that walked continents slowly rather than racing them in a day. We do not chase alarms. We follow patterns as if they were migrating animals we respect from a distance, in ice that has grown old with dignity. Bubbles hold a record of air that practiced extremes and then found balance again, the way a hand steadies after pouring too fast. Greenhouse curves rise, tilt, settle, not as penance but as physics, and their story is patient enough to include us without centering us. In stalagmites, rings widen for a time when drought tightened its belt, then ease back into roundness when clouds remember their roots. Pollen spectra narrow to hardy few, and later widen to choirs that include shy understories. The evidence does not shout, it breathes, and our job is to match its tempo. Could it be that we're reading a lullaby of loss, not because loss is sweet, but because the planet's response prefers tenderness where catastrophe is not required, editing by subtraction until resilience can speak in small voices again? We sit with that possibility, the way one sits with news that is not final, letting hope and humility share a chair. Along a long quiet shore, beach ridges record storms as lines of lifted shells, each crest a memory of wind and moon, and between them low swales fill with peat that stores patient carbon brown and cool. When extinctions pass through such coasts, the ridges do not vanish. They space themselves differently. The shell mix shifts toward tougher forms, the peat darkens more quickly or more slowly, an arithmetic of subtlety that asks for careful eyes and softer claims. Is it possible that a civilization's absence could be felt this way too, not as a headline layer, but as a smoothing of noise? Fewer ashes that smell of invention, fewer metals in the marsh, a river learning its floodplain again, a night sky relieved of a brightness it never asked for. Maybe, maybe not. We allow the thought to pass like a tide under a pier, steadying the posts rather than shaking them, and notice that our own pulse has found a quieter key. Subduction moves like a closing eyelid under oceans we cannot see, tucking whole shelves of sediment into heat that will translate them, and yet the margins keep scraps. The melange of a world that refuses to lose every page, a quilt of fragments where a bone blur meets a chert ribbon meets a clay that once tasted smoke. We read these collages like memory itself, incomplete, persuasive, honest in their seams. Entropy here is not the enemy of truth. It is the editor that trims excess and leaves meaning behind, the way erosion reveals the shape of a hill by refusing to keep every grain. We find ourselves less interested in proving and more interested in listening, telling the difference between a silence that is absence and a silence that is rest, between a gap that is wound and a gap that is healing. Some pauses carry loud signatures. Iridium dusting a boundary after a rock from space taught noon to be night. Shocked quartz ticking like stars in sand. Others arrive soft. Plankton abandoning warm seas. Reefs going quiet under acid. Forests swapping diversity for sameness, until fires learn the paths by heart. We watch for both without choosing drama over truth. Is it possible that our time will resolve into a mixed chord, one bright strike that fades quickly in ash, one deep drone that lingers in ratios, one gentle diminuendo as systems relearn their old choreography? The fossil record would hold all three like hands in a circle, not blaming, not absolving, simply keeping time. Maybe, maybe not. We breathe with the page and let the need to be certain drift away like silt in clear water, settling only when the current calms. In the valley's late light, dragonflies stitch blue thread over a slow river, and their bodies carry the elements of rocks born in mountains far upstream. Life and stone keep exchanging names. We realize that every extinction is also a redistribution, matter leaving faces we recognize to join forms we do not. Calcium from shells to chalk, chalk to cliff, cliff to sand, sand to glassy eyes of fish that will one day become limestone again. Loss is real. Circulation is also real. Both can be held without breaking. Could it be that the kindest reading of silence is patience, the willingness to wait long enough for the next voices to arrive, for the next pages to lift from the press of weight and water and appear as thin lines of firsts? We nod to that thought as to an elder at the doorway, and do not enter until invited. Night comes on with mineral steadiness, cooling the ledges, sharpening stars in the river's skin, and in that clarity, our questions thin to a fine, workable thread. We ask only what can be asked softly, where the record pauses, what small firsts follow, a delicate shell that returns, a fern that writes its shadow on new mud, a pollen grain that travels a little farther than its parents dared. And yet, if the silences can be read without fear, if the planet's long breath includes these tender holds between notes, then perhaps the next curiosity is not about the pause at all, but about the almost those anomalies that refuse to settle, the ratios that lean and won't explain why, the mineral hues that look like memory wearing a disguise, waiting for us to notice without rushing to name. And the mineral hues that look like memory wearing a disguise, waiting for us to notice without rushing to name, we learn to keep company with anomalies, as one keeps company with shy animals, quietly, without reaching too fast. A core is lifted from lake mud, and the layers behave, year on year, like fine script, until a slender horizon leans strangely, carbon ratios tilting like a head, trying to hear, pollen narrowing to grasses that love edges, and a dust so fine it tastes like distance, settles where local winds usually rule. Could it be ash from a mountain we forgot, or soot from summers that burned beyond the forest's habit, or the breath of engines speaking a dialect? We don't expect this far back. Maybe, maybe not. We let the data rest on the table like stones warmed by sun, and the warmth is not proof, only comfort. Isotopes whisper in half tones, oxygen heavier by a hair, nitrogen lighter by a sigh, and the murmur says only, something leaned. In cave rings, calcite learns a new rhythm for a while, not because the drip sped up, but because the water above took a different path through soil that had changed its mind, less cover, more light, and impatience in roots where shade once taught moderation. We hold a thin slice to the lamp, and the translucent bands show a pulse that doesn't match drought alone, a patient inconsistency that resists our quick categories. Is it possible that anomalies are the planet's way of leaving placeholders for stories not yet told? The geological equivalent of a bookmark placed by a thoughtful hand that plans to return. We consider desert varnish carrying elements that have no business arriving on that wind, peat layers tasting faint metals too even for a mine, stalagmites catching halogens more at home in distant seas. None are loud, all are loyal to their small truth. Not because the earth wants to tease, but because complexity prefers to speak in chords, and chords can hide single notes without malice. Along a coast where storm berms lie like old sentences, a narrow strip of shell is wrong, species mismatched to temperature by a degree, as if a warm current trespassed where cold should have stood guard. The strip lasts a hand's width, and then the proper cast returns. We ask the ocean gently, and it answers with eddies, with the moon's blinks, with the long conveyor slipping in and out of stride, yet the strip sits there like a raised eyebrow, inviting patience. Maybe a distant iceberg freshened the surface and sent clines astray. Maybe a river carried a city's invisible taste to the sea, and the sea kept it for one season before letting it go. We do not call it a confession. We call it a question kept safe in sand. Entropy blurs edges over time, But sometimes the blur itself is the clue, the soft halo around an event that refuses to be a sharp line, because life distributed its response through roots, through shells, through breath. In mountain schists, mica gleams where pressure combed chaos into order, and a garnet holds a core richer in one element than its rim, a history frozen in a sphere the size of a berry. Something in the metamorphic soup changed as it grew, and the garnet recorded both diets without argument. Could our centuries leave similar zoning, trace metals richer in beginnings and gentler in ends, pigments fading to minerals preferred by quiet soils, anomalies that relax over depth, as stewardship learns to choose softer chemistries? Maybe, maybe not. The rock does not flatter our hope, but it doesn't dismiss it either. It accepts what's offered and makes it coherent at its pace. On a plain 1,000 miles from any coast, a low blanket, built of glacial breath and patient winds, keeps one layer a shade darker and a touch magnetically stronger, as if fine ash laid its hand there for a season. Volcanic, industrial, extraterrestrial, the terms are our furniture, not the Earth's, and the layer is content to be a soft riddle until we bring better ears. At night by a quiet estuary, the water reflects a sky that once wore a brighter lace of city and now wears fewer threads. Beneath the surface, marsh sediments store a thin page that knew more soot and then chose less, knew more nitrogen and then eased back. A curve that relaxes the way shoulders do when a long task ends. Is it possible that anomalies can be mercies as well as warnings? That a record can show restraint returning, and that return rid as a kindness left behind for strangers? We listen for that tone in ice that thickens after a fever, in tree rings that grow humble and even, in coral that rebuilds with fewer stress lines, and we let the possibility calm us without making us sleepy to what still leans. Maybe anomalies are invitations to look longer, to compare farther, to test our stories against stones that do not need us to be right. We practice the discipline of almost a pattern, almost a confession, almost a map. And in the almost our breath lengthens. The world prefers gradients to cliffs, and gradients ask for care. Ocean subduction will take many pages under, but margins will save what they can, stitching melange like quilts of mixed winters. Erosion will thin sharp lines and leave durable trends. Entropy will erase pride and preserve tendencies. We rest in that distribution, in a planet that forgets loudly and remembers softly, that keeps anomalies as seeds rather than monuments. And yet, if the quiet misfits and gentle leanings are truly doors, then the next step is not to force them open, but to bring a light that does not blind. What patient methods, what kinder instruments, what tender questions could we carry into the field, so that, when a pattern finally speaks, we hear not only what happened, but what it asks of us next? And what patient methods, what kinder instruments, what tender questions could we carry into the field, so that when a pattern finally speaks, we hear not only what happened, but what it asks of us next? We begin by letting slowness be our first tool, the way a river learns its banks by lingering, the way ice learns a valley by staying. We picture hands quiet on a core barrel at dawn, breath clouding just enough to mark the cold, and in that small cloud we remember how every measurement is a conversation between what we wish to know and what the world is ready to say. Not because data are shy, but because time is large, and large things prefer soft voices. We bring instruments that read the faintest changes, mass spectrometers that can hear a single atom lean heavier or lighter, microscopes that turn dust into geography, sensors that taste the air for what it learned yesterday, and we practice asking without hurry, could this tilt in carbon be a season of fire, a century of engines, or only wind up from a distant drought? Could this narrowing of pollen be grief, or only a temporary preference written by weather? Could this odd metal be a volcano telling us to look elsewhere? Maybe, maybe not. We record the maybe as faithfully as the number, because the maybe is a kind of truth too. Along the coast we launch a small boat at a tide that knows us, and lower a core into silt that has been listening longer than our language has existed. Each meter drawn up is a tapestry of arrivals, diatoms like glass snow, ash like shadows, microplastics like restless punctuation, and rather than judge, we sort and count and let the layers say their own names in their own order. We turn to the sea's slow conveyors, to currents that speak in temperatures and salinities, and we follow their sentences with moored instruments that hum through winters, reading how heat and salt braid stories across basins we cannot cross in one life. Could it be that a spaced pair of measurements kept for a decade is kinder than 1,000 in a month? Could it be that patience is not a luxury, but the only way the planet can be heard without being interrupted? We set our clocks by the long things, El Niño and La Niña, passing the microphone back and forth, monsoons practicing their return, glaciers remembering how to feed rivers through ceaseless summer, not because drama is untrue, but because truth also includes the absence of urgency. In caves we move like thoughts at midnight, soft-footed, lamps dimmed to amber, pulling slender cores from stalagmites that read rain as if it were music. Oxygen mole, 18 and carbon-13 marking crescendos, and rests in a notation older than the first cave painting. We listen for the parts where the score goes strange, then returns, and we restrain our narratives until the rock agrees. Silence here is method, not mystery. On high plateaus, we set out collectors for dust, week after week, season after season, because the sky writes in fine print, and only long stacks of pages reveal the plot. Is it possible that the best instrument is continuity, that watching one place with devotion can teach us more than touching 1,000 places in passing? Maybe, maybe not. The field log fills with small sentences, and the small sentences become a paragraph, and the paragraph becomes a year, and the year becomes a curve, whose grace humbles even the proudest theory. We invite living archivists to the table, trees with rings that widen and narrow like careful breathing, corals with bands that hold the taste of water, fish ear bones that keep the age of currents as secret calendars, and we treat them not as props, but as colleagues. Their evidence is not loud, but when placed beside stone and ice and air, the chorus becomes legible without forcing any single voice to shout. Entropy sits among us like an elder who has heard this story many times. It reminds us that noise will always attend signal, that decay will always soften edges, and that the art is not in erasing uncertainty, but in reducing its cruelty. Could we design our questions so they leave the landscape as they found it, or gentler than they found it? Could a probe be a guest, a drill be a brief and courteous visitor, a satellite, a patient witness that dims its lights to let the night stay night? Maybe, maybe not. We write care into our protocols as if care itself were a unit of measure, because someday it will be, if not here, then in the memory of those who share the field after us. And still, instruments alone are not enough. Perception must be trained like a muscle that learns to hold still. We practice seeing gradients instead of cliffs, practice hearing the almost that keeps returning across separate archives, a subtle leaning in isotopes that mirrors a brief unevenness in rings, a thin metal in peat that coincides with a swerve in shells, a brightness in airglow that nods to a decade when nights worked harder than they should have. We test for coincidence, and then we test for companionship, asking whether patterns know each other's names across distance. Ocean subduction will carry some of our questions under, but margins will keep others, and uplift will bring them back in a script altered yet coherent. In this circulation we accept that the planet is co-author. It chooses the pace, it edits for stability, it prefers continuity to proclamation. Our science becomes a form of listening that honors these preferences, long campaigns over quick campaigns, transparent uncertainties over confident mistakes, gentle claims that can survive translation into other forms of evidence. At dusk, the field packs feel lighter because we decided to leave some tools in their cases and bring patience instead. We carry out what we carried in, and we leave behind only holes small enough to forget and gratitude large enough to remember. We sit with the team and watch the first stars open like tiny doors, and we let the day be incomplete without calling it a failure. The picture is wider than us, and that is its comfort. Perhaps the kindest question is one that offers the world an easy no, not because we fear the answer, but because consent matters even in geology. Could the Earth be asking us to ask less often and look longer, to measure fewer things and keep them longer, to replace extraction with invitation? Maybe, maybe not. Our notebooks close with the soft scuff of paper on paper, and the night folds around our camp like a careful hand. We fall towards sleep, thinking of instruments that do not yet exist, sensors that hear clay's hum when ions settle, analyzers that taste rain without taking it from the soil, satellites that watch without pushing light into darkness, and in the imagining we feel a gentleness that might guide invention as surely as any blueprint. If time is the true laboratory, then our work is to keep the lights low and the door open, to make room for slow reactions to finish, and for quiet evidence to reveal itself without pressure. And yet, if we can become this kind of listener, if our patience can turn anomalies into teachers and records into relationships, then the next tender curiosity rises like mist from a cool river. What will all this listening do to us? What kind of identity forms when we measure ourselves against deep time, and how gently can we hold the thought that we are both the question, and in a small way part of the answer the Earth is writing? And what kind of identity forms when we measure ourselves against deep time, and how gently can we hold the thought that we are both the question, in a small way part of the answer the Earth is writing? We lie back into the quiet as if into a tide pool of stars, and let the scale of things unfasten our hurry without unfastening our care. We feel the planet's long pulse under our own, a slow arithmetic counted in dunes that walk and glaciers that breathe, in plates that exchange boundaries with the patience of elders trading stories, and within that pulse our days become bright syllables, not because we are small, but because smallness is precise, able to place a pebble where it steadies a stream, able to leave a gate open so a flood can find its old meadow again. Maybe identity at this scale is not a flag, but a posture, not a shout, but a listening. Maybe we are most ourselves when we remember that fossils are translations, that stone is a verb, that memory is a choreography of matter, learning new names. We try on that posture like a coat at dusk, loose, warm, with pockets deep enough for questions, and we walk the rim of a quiet lake while evening turns the surface to graphite, and in that slow mirror we recognize a kind of kindness we rarely notice in daylight, the way the world receives us without recording the details too sharply, the way entropy makes room for beginnings by letting edges soften. We wonder what it means to belong to a planet that forgets loudly and remembers softly, that keeps some of our traces as ratios and lets the rest go as wind. Perhaps identity under deep time is a promise to become legible in gentle ways, to design artifacts that love to be soil, to tell stories that can be read by roots as easily as by eyes. Is it possible that the self we bring to this work is not the self that seeks permanence, but the one that seeks good endings? Steel choosing ironstone, glass choosing sand, data choosing humility, so that the next hands can fold it into their own long projects without splinters. Not because anonymity is virtue, but because modesty travels farther. The quieter the line, the longer it remains part of the paragraph. In this mood, even loss shows us a usable light. The trilobite's vanished face becomes a lesson in pattern's persistence. The burnt forest's ash becomes a nursery in rain. The glacier's retreat becomes a new braid of river that writes fertile commas across the plain. Maybe, maybe not. The uncertainty is a cradle, and we rest inside it, hearing the creek count stones as if counting years backwards into a patience we can borrow when our voice is thin. We ask what memory we would be proud to leave in limestone or in clay, not as a monument, but as a friendliness in chemistry, a gentler carbon curve, a softened nitrogen, a habit of metals that prefer to sleep in common minerals rather than roam. Identity then becomes a choice to be metabolized, to move through ocean subduction without wounding, to pass through metamorphism as color rather than as shard. to be taken up by fungi and returned as dark sweetness to the root. We begin to like this picture of ourselves, useful even as dust, welcome, even as silence, distinct only where distinction helps the whole. Could it be that we are most visible to the future when we are easiest to forget, our care felt as reliability in rings and valves and stalagmite bands that relax into evenness after a century of leaning? We press our ear to the ground and let the low tremor of life passing minerals hand to hand become a lullaby. The planet is not asking for confessions, only for companionship over distances that outlast names. We can do that. We can learn to be along kindness. In the sky, satellites thread their patient paths, and we think of identity as orbit, staying, circling, adjusting, returning below. A fox crosses the gravel bar and leaves prints. The river will edit by morning, and we think of identity as trace, soft, timely, dissolving into usefulness, rather than insisting on outline. If we are both question and answer, then our question is simple: how to live, so the archive of the world can keep writing without stutter. And our answer is simple too, though not easy. Listen, linger, lesson, design for geologies we will never see. Maybe to be human at this scale is to be an intermediary between fast and slow, carrying messages from seasons to strata, holding space for the long conversations that stone and water and wind rehearse until they are fluent again. Maybe, maybe not. The stars bloom, the temperature slips, the field cools its breath, and everything that needs to be said tonight has found its gentler phrasing. And yet, if identity can become this light touch, if our stories can move at the speed of care, then a new wandering turns like a tide in the dark. When morning returns and we step back onto the path, what practical tenderness will we carry into our tools and maps? What small, repeatable gestures will teach the ground to trust us enough to keep telling the truth? And what small, repeatable gestures will teach the ground to trust us enough to keep telling the truth? We start with the kind that barely leaves a footprint, the kind that learns the landscape's handwriting and writes in the same hand. We step onto the path with lighter maps, the sort that change with rain and season, that accept detours where salamanders cross and where roots rise to breathe. Not because we are timid, but because timidity is a kind of intelligence when the archive is living under our shoes. We watch how water prefers to move when uncorrected, how silt rests when it has options, how a flood, given a field, becomes a gardener instead of a judge. Maybe the tenderest instrument is a gate left open at the right time. Maybe the bravest decision is a road unbuilt where the soil still speaks in the vowels of wet and the consonants of roots. Maybe, maybe not. We carry this grammar into our tools, asking shovels to shape terraces that slow a hillside's breath, asking culverts to become culverts only when a beaver cannot, asking fire to return in low voices, ember by ember, so the forest remembers without fear. We lean into practices that design their own erasure, a foundation that will one day dissolve to sand without bitterness, a pigment that agrees to become clay, a polymer that rehearses how to be food for fungi instead of a fossil that refuses every invitation. Could it be that true durability is the art of ending well, the quiet skill of letting go into elements the world already knows how to carry? We imagine alloys choosing friends they can leave gracefully, glasses that unlearn their clarity into beach sparkle, concrete that yields its calcium back to rivers, the way bone returns to soil as a gentle mineral rain. Entropy is not our enemy when we meet it halfway. Decay becomes choreography, a series of elegant bows in which structures thank the landscape and step aside. We can measure this humility in isotope trails, a softened carbon curve that shows not absence but rhythm, nitrogen that relaxes where floodplains breathe again, oxygen in stalagmites that rounds its edges as shade comes back to streams. We can hear it in peat that stacks without panic, in reefs that calcify without flinching, in wind that lifts fewer ashes and more seeds. In cities we rehearse slowness in the midst of speed, roofs teaching rain to linger in gardens before they enter the throat of a storm drain, pavements that remember they were once riverbed and now exhale heat through pockets of evening meadow, alleys that swap glare for moth-soft light, so night's pollinators can keep their work. We time our bright to the needs of sleep, not because darkness is a scold, but because it is a nurse, a keeper of circadian maps written in every cell. What if the mapmaker's ink was composed of moss and patience? If zoning codes learned the movements of groundwater? If transit followed the lines of an old ridge the way a glacier once did? Not as nostalgia, but as competence borrowed from deep time. The atmosphere would answer in its subtle language, a curve that does not smooth to zero but to grace, winters that keep their sharpened edges without cruelty, summers that cool in evening by habit rather than by effort. Maybe the truest measure of design is the sigh a city breathes when the wind arrives and finds nothing urgent to mend. We take this gentleness to coasts, where attention means letting marshes be the elastic lungs they always were, letting dunes migrate like patient animals, letting estuaries memorize tides instead of walls. We stand back enough that oysters can glue waves into quieter sentences, and eelgrass can comb sediment into clarity. The ocean archives our restraint in the wideness of its nurseries, in salinity that returns to balance, in the lower pulse of storm scars set down in beach ridges. Could it be that stewardship is less a series of inventions and more a commitment to honor processes that have been casting their votes for millions of years? Erosion as a slow sculptor, deposition as a careful clerk, subduction as the world's recycling oath. Our role becomes chorus, not solo. We sing where the line drops out. We rest where the score says rest. We hold a note long enough for cliffs to answer in gravel and for gravel to answer in soil. Up in the mountains, we let trails pass through on tiptoe, stepping stones spaced to respect alpine roots, switchbacks that resist erosion by agreeing with gravity instead of defying it. We choose to read the avalanche paths as letters in stone, not spaces for sport alone, but corridors where snow's memory moves unimpeded, cold's calligraphy intact. Fire returns in polyphony, mosaic burns that write punctuation instead of paragraphs, cool flame that edits understory and leaves crowns to speak of age. We look for our reflection in tree rings and ask to be seen as evenness where we were once a jagged spike, a century of habits that let cambium widen calmly, let sapwood thicken without alarm, let carbon settle into lignin the way story settles into elder mouth. Maybe, maybe not. We make our pact with time in increments. This season we will listen to the creek louder than the road. This year we will measure our harvest by the future's appetite. This decade we will let a floodplain rehearse being a floodplain again. At the edge of a quarry turned quiet, we sit with the exposed archive and practice being students, bedding planes telling of currents, crossbeds reading like wind frozen mid-gesture, ash layers naming brief ferocities. And we ask our single brave question without haste, what do you need from us to keep speaking? The rock answers by cooling under our palms, by shedding sand in a language we can learn only by staying. We promise to design for metamorphism, for weathering, for eventuality, buildings that dream of being riverstones, machines that hope to be ore, circuits that anticipate clay. We allow our identities to blur into usefulness, to travel through decay without becoming harm, to arrive in a future as somebody's nutrient, somebody's tool, someone else's shade. Is it possible that the ground will recognize this, and in recognizing, keep more of our careful chapters when plates fold and seas advance, not as a favor to us, but as respect for coherence? Night arrives gentle as silt, and we feel the planet's biography moving around us, oceans overturning like a slow breath, mountains aging into plains, trenches taking in and sending back. We match that movement with a small vow, to ask fewer loud questions and more long ones, to prefer a dataset that grows old over an insight that burns out, to light our work like moonlight instead of noon. The fox passes again, and its steps leave nothing. The river cannot handle by morning. We take this as instruction, and yet, if we can keep our touch this light, if our tools can learn to speak the dialect of soil and wind and water without raising their voices, then another curiosity glows just beyond the reach of our lamp, when the earth finally answers in kind. When a mineral grows a shade we taught it, when a cave band rounds because we stepped back, how will we learn to read gratitude in stone without mistaking it for our own reflection? And how will we learn to read gratitude in stone without mistaking it for our own reflection? We practice a kind of seeing that stays small, like a fingertip on cool quartz, like breath held before a match is struck. We go back to the cliff that has been patient with us, and notice what has softened since we last came. A cave band rounding where drip water grew less bitter, a peat core thickening without the acrid signatures that once leaned its curve, a marsh silt brightening as halogens learn to leave with the tide. Not because the world is clapping for us, but because systems remember differently when pressure eases, because chemistry relaxes when stress steps away. Could it be that gratitude here is simply coherence returning, ratios that settle into steadier vowels, growth lines that stop flinching, river stones that carry fewer scars between floods? Maybe, maybe not. We kneel and let our shadows fall out of the frame so the mineral colors can speak in their own register, and what we hear is less praise than ease, a cadence that no longer hurries to correct itself. In the cave, lamplight fades to amber and stalagmites show their new patience as a gentler spacing. Oxygen, neontine sediments that found their balance. Carbon-13, smoothing as soils above knit together and fed roots instead of flames. We do not write our names in wet stone. We pack away the urge and write our dates in rain gauges, in longshore profiles, in a notebook that smells faintly of lichen and graphite. Is it possible that gratitude is a quieter entropy, a turning toward forms that share rather than hoard, a bias toward aggregates that welcome, lattices that forgive impurities, crystals that grow clear where once they clouded? We imagine garnets zoning with subtler gradients, cave milk sealing fractures a little faster, beach ridges laying down in narrower steps, because storms are no longer spoken to in shouts. We do not claim credit, we witness compatibility, the way consonance in music feels like relief without owing anyone applause. Along a river that we once straightened and have since returned to meander, the banks show a new handwriting, willow roots stitching edges that used to split, bars migrating with grace, silt settling where fish need calm. A swallow does a small calligraphy of loops above riffles, and in its loops a geometry we did not design persists anyway. Maybe gratitude is the river's willingness to teach again how to stack gravels by size under a moderate flow, how to drape fine sands into glistening crescents at dusk, how to lace oxygen through water like lace through a sleeve. We test isotopes not for applause but for restfulness. Nitrogen losing its sharp accent as floodplains breathe. Carbon finding a middle between rush and hoard. Oxygen writing the old diurnal swing in clear daylight. The marsh nearby breathes under the moon and the mud listens, closing tiny mouths on the day's excess and opening them to release what is finished. It is a choreography of trust, not of triumph. In mountains given back to mosaic fire, tree rings carry a new calm, narrow years and wider years in a comfortable conversation. No long stutter of drought unbroken by grace, no sudden fat band that reads like rescue after panic. We lay a hand on cool bark and feel sap rise with measured effort, and in that steadiness we learn how to read the gratitude of forests, in cambium that does not brace, in resin that does not scream, in cones opened by heat that never ran to violence. Down the slope, a talus that used to sprint every spring now inches, roots netting bigger chunks, lichens painting patient continents on faces once slick with fresh fracture. Could it be that the planet thanks us not in words but in the resumption of habitual rhythms, in the reappearance of normal variants, in the way anomalies grow rare and uninteresting? Maybe, maybe not. We resist the vanity of the mirror. We do not see our reflection in every round curve. We do not sign our names to every eased graph. On the coast, dunes walk again under a grammar of wind and grass, and when storms come, they come as editors, not as authors. The beach after looks like a page with notes in the margins, not a book torn in half. In the long cause from estuary mud, the thin season of microbeads thins further and then ends, Soot signatures taper to the geometry of trees. Copper learns to stay upstream in hills where it belongs, bound in stone, booked for metamorphism rather than for blood. We are careful. We do not call this gratitude. We call it capacity reborn, a system remembering its competencies. Is it possible that this is enough? That the cleanest thank you is the absence of rupture, the return of small forgettable years, the kind our grandparents did not think to record because the world did not ask for headlines? We consider that anonymity is a kind of praise in geologic time. If our season vanishes into curves that soothe, into layers that blend, into clays that do not carry strange guests, then we have been heard by the only audience that matters here, the processes themselves. At night, under a sky that has learned our better dimmers, the air glow is soft and steady, and satellites pass like quiet intentions, not as proclamations. We can almost see the long-wave warmth of the planet, leaning back toward its older balance, a spectrum smoothing where it once lifted, not because anyone applauds, but because energy budgets do what budgets do when spending stops exceeding season. We think about ocean subduction carrying our century downward in thin layers, translated into minerals that will ride pressure and heat to futures none of us will see. If gratitude persists there, it does so as trace elements that prefer common company, as textures that strengthen rather than fracture, as inclusions that aid growth instead of slowing it. Entropy is the courier for these small gifts, distributing them where they will do the least harm and the most good, reminding us that generosity at this scale is logistics, not lyric. So we learn to read thank yous as ease, not as echoes of ourselves. We look for gentler slopes in grafts, for middles that return and stay, for frequencies that settle into ranges life can hum along with. We look for rivers untroubled enough to forget our names by morning and rocks content to weather into soils that do not carry bitterness. Maybe the best gratitude is geological boredom, the blessed monotony of valves repeating light, dark light with no exclamation marks for a very long time. Maybe not. We are content to be uncertain and useful, to hold a lamp low and watch the page while the planet writes at its own speed, neither rushed by our praise nor slowed by our pride. We leave a field with nothing taken but notes, and nothing left but footsteps that dew will erase, and we feel inside a small, durable humility that will travel to the next sight, to the next question, to the next careful core. And yet, if reading gratitude requires this much restraint, if listening asks us to dissolve our reflection until only the world remains, then another gentle curiosity rises with the breeze across the grass. How do we carry this quiet back into our proof and our doubt? How do we share such fragile pages with others without tearing them? And what language can hold both evidence and wonder without bruising either? And how do we share such fragile pages with others without tearing them? And what language can hold both evidence and wonder without bruising either? We try speaking the way rivers speak at evening, low and steady, carrying stones without scraping them, letting the weight of facts ride quiet under a surface that reflects whatever sky is present. We imagine a room where cores rest on cradles and the air smells faintly of clay and ethanol, and we invite the patient listener to stand beside us, not behind a rope. We point not with fingers but with breath, guiding the eye to a thin dark band where soot once leaned, to a bright ash where a mountain punctuated a century, to the long evenness that followed like a lullaby returning. Not because story is decoration, but because story is how the hand remembers what the eye has learned. The numbers remain exact as stars, and the tale moves slowly enough that no curve is bent to fit a wish. Maybe this is the tone we were missing, not persuasion but companionship, the kind that stays through the pauses and does not hurry the page to turn. We choose metaphors that keep their feet on the ground, lakes as librarians who never raise their voices, stalagmites as quiet drummers who count in droplets, dunes as sleepwalkers who follow wind by feel. Each image anchored to a process the way a fossil is anchored to its bed, held by chemistry, not opinion. Could it be that wonder behaves best when tethered to what is measurable, the isotope that leans, the ring that narrows, the valve that thins, and that all grows larger, not smaller, when it shares a room with restraint. We say maybe, maybe not. Our sentences lengthen like twilight because haste is a kind of violence here. We let silence finish thoughts. We are tempted to complete. We let a graph speak before a metaphor answers it. We let uncertainty keep its proper name instead of borrowing certainty's clothes. Evidence is patient. Our task is to become patient enough to travel at its speed. Outside that careful room, the world asks for headlines, but deep time refuses to sprint, so we offer intervals. Chapters read at the pace of seasons, dispatches from cliffs and cores that arrive like soft weather reports. The peat is stacking, the reef is breathing easier, the snow line is lingering where it used to. The river has remembered a curve. We avoid the drum of triumph and the trumpet of doom. We keep to the metronome of processes, erosion that edits without malice, deposition that files without applause, subduction that recycles with perfect anonymity. Is it possible that trust grows where predictions are modest and corrections are welcomed like rain after dust? And when a surprise arrives, a curve that bends where we thought it would rest, a pigment in clay that changes its mind, we admit surprise the way a field admits flood by making room and learning from the shape the water takes. We practice showing our work like a tide pool shows its creatures when the moon leans back. No drama, only openness. The methods are visible, the drill marks, the sampling plan, the dates with their halos of uncertainty, and the listener is invited to wade, to ask, to touch gently. Data become a landscape where a walk is possible. This ridge is carbon, this valley is oxygen, this distant line of hills is temperature inferred from shells, and over there the horizon is decorated with ash that fell on a day no one now remembers. Not because we want to impress, but because walking turns numbers into distances we can feel in our legs, and feeling makes care easier to hold without forcing it. Maybe the most persuasive thing we can offer is the sight of our own restraint, the places we refuse to leap, the analogies we release when they begin to pull too hard, the questions we keep open like windows. We let repetition do ethical work, not because repetition is dull, but because the planet writes in refrains and we honor the form. Again the cave ring, again the lake band, again the coral line, each iteration slightly different, each difference meaningful in a way that does not need to be shouted. We learn to say I don't know with the confidence of bedrock, to add yet with the softness of silt, to say still with the steadiness of tide. Could it be that this blend, firm ground, soft edges, steady rhythm, teaches a listener to sleep without surrendering attention, to rest while keeping a hand on the thread, to accept that some answers arrive like seeds and some like storms and most like seasons? We do not apologize for the pace. We apologize only when we rush. Night gathers around the lab windows and our reflections float over shelves of rock like ghosts of potential mistakes. We dim the lights and let the specimens keep their dignity. Evidence rests better in the dark. So do we. In that quiet, we practice a final habit to end each chapter, not with a claim but with a door, opened just enough to invite the next question to step through on its own feet. And yet, if telling can be this gentle, if proof can share a pillow with wonder and both wake clear, then the next page waits outside under weather, a return to the field where the archive is still being written, where dust and dew and small lives keep making text, asking us to follow at daybreak and to read again, slowly, with clean hands. And to read again slowly with clean hands, we step out at first light when the air still remembers night, and the ground feels like a page waiting for its first mark. We move the way dew moves across a meadow, light and everywhere at once, not because we must hurry, but because noticing is a gentle kind of work that likes to be done before the day grows loud. The trail leads us along a ridge where shale holds the ghost of old riverbeds, crossbeds slanting toward winds that have forgotten their names, and we pause at a ledge where a thin seam of ash makes the rock taste faintly of lightning. This is how evidence greets us, matter of fact, unruffled, older than our questions and willing to unspool only as fast as we can stand to listen. Maybe the core we'll lift later will carry a lean-in carbon that matches this ash, a resonance between cliff and mud. Maybe the stalagmite below the valley will show a widened ring where drought walked here once and then grew tired. Maybe, maybe not. We let these maybes line our pockets like smooth stones, weight enough to keep our steps quiet. Downslope, the river remembers a curve we return to it, and the gravel tells us the restoration is holding long tongues of cobble laid by moderate water, brighter bands of sand tucked into leas where dace rest, silt laid softly, where willow roots keep the bank from slumping into panic. We bend and wash a hand in the current that was cold yesterday, and is cold today because snowfields up valley still practice their slow gift. Each melt a pale thread in a larger braid. Could it be that climate's patient recovery is most visible in small reliabilities? The hour shade arrives on a riffle. The date frogs choose to begin. The way oxygen in water keeps its diurnal swing without losing its nerve. We record temperatures and smile at how uneventful the numbers are. How steady, how unworthy of a headline, and exactly worthy of a life. Not because nothing is changing, but because change is returning to a rhythm that creatures can memorize without fear. We cross a meadow where peat builds by inches per century, dark as old tea, and a core from its edge will later show our names in the faintest way. Mercury falling quiet, nitrogen softening its accent, soot thinning to the geometry of trees instead of stacks. The peat will not thank us, but it will thicken, and thickening is a planet's way of keeping a promise. In the shade line, a stump is becoming soil at a pace that feels like forgiveness. Fungi advancing in patient constellations, each white thread a sentence of exchange, calcium for sugars, trace metals for shelter, a ledger that always balances because it refuses debt. Is it possible that identity for a forest is simply this ongoing barter, light to wood, wood to loam, loam to root, root to rain cloud through leaf, and for us, identity becomes our skill at stepping in without breaking the circle, at stepping back before the circle must repair us. Maybe, maybe not. We tuck our questions into the quiet and keep walking. At a limestone cut, shells that stopped being shells 100 million years ago keep their posture in rock, ribs, spirals, hinges, all reorganized as calcite, and yet still themselves, which is a good lesson for any creature hoping to last, endure by changing, stay by letting go. A vein of quartz sutures the wall, milk white and resolute, where water once filled a fracture and cooled into patience. If gratitude can be read anywhere, it's here in the fit. Two halves of a wound joined so perfectly that lichen cannot find the seam. We touch the cool and feel our own heat leave, which is a kind of prayer, and the vein tells us nothing except that time loves closure that heals rather than hides. Could it be that when we speak well of the earth, our words should act like this quartz, filling the split with clarity that hardens into something helpful, refusing to glamorize the break or to ignore it? We do not force the metaphor, we let it pass like cloud across a ridgeline. Toward noon the air lifts, the valley begins its updraft, and swallows etch their moving script above a field where insects rise like punctuation. The day is learning its syntax and we are allowed to witness. On a far slope, last year's burn reveals this year's grammar. Lodgepole cones opened by modest heat. Aspen sprouts making a silver chorus line in light that was once barricaded. Charcoal thin enough to feed without burdening, and soil holding because rain arrived when it should. Ocean subduction is nowhere visible here, yet we feel its promise in the steadiness of mountains that will in another book entirely tilt old seafloors toward heat. Even our small choices ride those grand conveyors. Nutrients we keep on hills won't wash to sea, won't become the wrong blooms in the wrong month, won't settle in shells as stress. We stand under the ordinary sky and accept that every modest act fits somewhere on a long belt we cannot see end to end. By afternoon we reach the cave mouth, a cool exhale from the hill's deep memory, and inside drip notes keep time with a steadiness that quiets even the loud thoughts. We set the core and ask permission with patience, not superstition, knowing that the act of taking should be as reversible as possible. that the hole we leave must be the smallest version of itself, that the data must return more care than we've withdrawn. The stalagmite's rings resolve under light later, oxygen stepping through seasons like a careful dancer, carbon tracing the hush of canopy above, magnesium nudging when soil's thin. None of it points at us, and that is the comfort. Is it possible we are finally writing ourselves into the record as evenness, as a return to middles, as a habit of letting processes do their work without our names stamped over every line? Maybe, maybe not. We label the sample with an ordinary date and a modest hope. Evening draws its blue veil over the ridge, and we read the day backward as we walk out, ash seam to river curve to peat, hush to shell wall to the soft ribs of wind across the meadow. Each place a sentence we are learning to pass without interrupting. The field book closes, not with conclusion, but with a steadier hand than yesterday's, and the world around us keeps writing in dew on grass, and in the faint tracks left by a night animal we will not see. And yet, if the archive is this alive, if the language of earth and water and air can be spoken in our hearing without strain, then the next page is not an answer, but an invitation to lie down and listen to the ground's long breath, to ask, very quietly, what else we might have mistaken for noise that is actually the beginning of a story. And what else we might have mistaken for noise that is actually the beginning of a story. We lie down on the gentle slope where the meadow tips into the dark of spruce, and listen until our own breath learns the cadence of crickets and the long hush between them. At first it is only rustle and faint wing, a creek folding over pebbles as if counting, a leaf turning on a stem to show its paler side to the night. But the longer we stay, the more the small patterns reveal their spine. A tawny moth returns to the same arc around a sedge 3 times, as if orbit were a habit shared by stars and pollen. A cool seam of air settles in the hollow and then lifts, repeating, like the slow lung of groundwater catching sleep. Could it be that memory begins as rhythm before it becomes record, that geology learned its patience from seasons practicing the same line until stone could not help but copy it? Maybe, maybe not. We watch dew form on a blade we choose, and notice how it thickens not smoothly, but in increments, jumps that are tiny and still startling when we are quiet enough to see them. Phase changes rehearsing the thresholds that rock later keeps as marble and slate, as schist and gneiss. In this soft laboratory, the ground tells the kind of history that has no edges. Soil shifts without moving, settling deeper into itself as microbes finish slow sentences, each reaction passing its heat into the night's ledger. The tally is small, but the page is wide, and across it run the threads of roots trading sugar for mineral, mineral for water, water for shade. We can almost hear the isotopes choosing, oxygen heavier in the last breath of afternoon, lighter as chill draws nearer, carbon leaning this way in the leaf, that way in the loam. Nitrogen softened by a floodplain returned to its generous memory. Is it possible that what we call noise is simply a chorus before we learn the parts? That dust on the tongue and faint resin in the air and the metallic hint of rain beyond the ridge are all lines of a text we usually rush past. We let our tongues be instruments, tasting silt lifted from the path, clay from a fingertip, pine that held sunlight all day and now releases it as scent. Not because we think this makes us wild, but because the senses are archives too, and the body has its own precise meters. The skin feels an edge when a cloud slips from the moon. The ear hears the upstream turn become downstream rest. The nose reads soil as surely as a lab reads isotope ratio. Far off, a stone pops as it cools, a tiny fracture in a boulder that will, by mornings and winters, shrug its way towards sand. Entropy is at work, but not as a thief, more as a collector dividing a treasure until every root has coin. We begin to recognize the quiet signatures of decay that heal, lichen writing slow acids into feldspar until it learns to be clay, bark falling into lattices that wick water towards seeds, insect borings that become conduits for rain, and then for hyphae, and then for the milky threads of a new plant's first reach. What if this is the draft of the planet's longer books? A rehearsal where soft tissues practice the habits that bones and shells and eventually mountains will keep. What if we live most of our lives in the preface and almost never admit it? Maybe, maybe not. We accept that humility here feels like comfort, the way a blanket does when the body already knows sleep is near. We think about ocean subduction in the middle of this meadow, and it is not absurd. The ground beneath us is part of that belt, part of that slow swallowing kindness that takes old floors into heat, so they can be more than they were, so the surface can keep telling new chapters without running out of paper. The cricket pauses and another takes its line, and it feels like a handoff from ridge to trench, from trench to plume, from plume to basalt cooling in columns that echo the stems around us, geometry repeating, because energy does what it knows. Could it be that the planet's memory is not a library at all, but a choir, voices entering and leaving, themes returning in different keys, techno-fossils and pollen and cave rings and ash, each finding the note they can hold? We don't need to conduct, we need to listen for motifs and let them braid themselves through our understanding until a pattern emerges gentle enough to carry into day. A breeze comes from uphill, the forest's breath, cool with the arithmetic of needles. It slips under our shirt and we think of isotope trails again, how this air will be trapped in ice someday far away and far above, how its exact mix of oxygen and vapor will tell a future hand that tonight the ridge was kind, that temperatures fell without hurry, that dew arrived on time and stayed. We feel strange pride at being so briefly legible, and then we let it go because legibility that clings becomes ego, and ego is a poor archive compared to moss. If we must be kept, let it be as evenness in a curve as a middle restored, as a lull returned to habit. Maybe our best contribution is the way our bodies at rest match the field's pulse, heart, creek, wind, crickets. 4 metronomes close enough to entrain, close enough to be one for a while. Maybe, maybe not. We drift at the edge of sleep, and notice how repetition changes from dull to devotional when effort eases and trust arrives. Clouds drift open and the stars show their slow grammar, constellations barely moving but promising motion. We remember that this light began long ago and is only now completing its sentence, and we wonder what begins here tonight, that will finish in stone, in shell, in snow. Perhaps the leaf twitch we saw is the start of a clay habit. Perhaps the dew jump is the opening meter of a stalagmite's ring. Perhaps the soft return of frogs to a date they kept for centuries and lost for a while will become a smoother ribbon of nitrogen in peat. Is it possible that listening like this is already a form of writing? That our restraint becomes part of what the meadow will keep us calm? That the very act of not interrupting is an edit the record will recognize? We do not ask for credit. We ask for fluency to be a species that can hold a chapter open with one finger and not crease the page. The night presses gently, and even the creek lowers its voice, as if the basin were rehearsing what it means to be silence without being empty. Our eyes close and behind them the day continues as after image. Ash seam, river curve, peat hush, shell wall, the soft ribs of wind, and all of it braided with a new thread we thought was noise, and now suspect is prologue. And yet, if beginnings are this small and this steady, if stories in the making sound like crickets and dew and distant fractures cooling into sand, then the next kindness we can offer is to bring this pace home, to rise with it, and walk by it, and let daylight inherit its patience. So when morning asks what we heard, we can answer, not much, and exactly enough. And to rise with it and walk by it and let daylight inherit its patience. So when morning asks what we heard, we can answer not much, and exactly enough. We stand slowly, as if not to startle the ground, and let the first light find our faces the way dew found the grass, bead by bead. We carry the night's cadence into motion, taking steps that remember crickets, steps that remember water counting stones, steps that do not argue with gravity's soft request. What if living by deep time is mostly this, choosing a speed that lets evidence become evident, a posture that lets memory arrive without being summoned? Maybe identity under daylight is less like a shout and more like a tide, returning to the same threshold. Not because it must, but because thresholds are where exchanges happen best. Salt for silt, heat for breath, question for answer that is also a question. We feel how a valley warms from the edges in air sliding down slopes like thought, settling into a good idea, and we think of isotope trails again. Oxygen's heavier voice lingering in last night's dew, its lighter syllables joining the day, carbon moving from leaf to air to stream in a grammar so familiar that even our silence participates. We take the long way to the ridge so we can watch how light edits the world, shadows pulling back like covers from a patient, revealing textures we did not deserve to know at once. On a cut face of sandstone, crossbeds glow like ribs under skin, telling of old winds that climbed and fell until a dune decided to sleep in stone. In the glow we notice a thin iron stain lifting from one layer to the next, a rusted memory of groundwater drawn up and let down over centuries, as if the rock practiced breathing before rivers taught it to sing. Could it be that daylight is a solvent for confusion when we agree to be dissolved, that attention under the sun keeps the gentleness of night, but swaps listening for looking without losing the hymn? We let repetition do its calm work, not because repetition is dull, but because the planet writes in refrains, again the drip, again the valve, again the ring, and each again tightens trust like a knot tied softly and checked. Down along the stream, we drink with cupped hands and taste the modest chemistry of now, a hint of granite, a thread of leaf, a chill that remembers snow. The water is not a metaphor, but it teaches anyway. Entropy moves here like kindness. Heat shared, edges rounded, burdens distributed until the channel fits its moment. Nothing perfect, everything coherent. Is it possible that our daylight craft is to design tools that behave like this water, useful because they change shape, honest because they run clear when left alone, durable because they move what needs moving and leave what needs to stay? Maybe circuits could learn the patience of clay, learning to fail into soil instead of into harm. Maybe pigments could learn to prefer minerals. The crust will welcome maybe, maybe not. We walk on, keeping our ideas in the shade where they won't wilt into certainty too soon. A hawk draws a clean ellipse over the meadow and holds, and in that stillness we understand orbit as a kind of listening, gravity's invitation answered with grace, not with struggle. We think about subduction again, about plates learning to bow and offer, about basalt remembering to rise where water has made a path. The choreography is slow, but its meaning is immediate. Endings are beginnings in another tense. Fossils by the trail confirm the lesson, a shell that unlearned calcium and relearned calcite, a leaf that traded vein for vein of mineral until absence became form. Translation as survival, translation as praise. If we are to last in any way that matters, perhaps we too must become translatable, our habits turning to soil, our structures consenting to weather into nutrients, our stories designed to be told by rivers after our voices are quiet. Not because self-erasure is noble, but because belonging is sturdy. By midday the air shimmers and heat makes mirage cities on the road beyond the hill. We pause and let the illusion pass through us without stealing our thirst. Atmosphere is memory made thin and always moving, dust from far ranges, salt from mornings along a coast we cannot see, pollen from a field that learned its old flowers again, and in this mix our breath becomes both archive and note added to a score in progress. Could it be that the gentlest ethics is to breathe like a tree, take only what helps, return what steadies, keep the exchange readable in rings and in rain? We close our eyes and feel the slow clock of heart and the slower clock of wind, and somewhere below these the geological clock that resets, not with bangs but with patience. A valley widened, a terrace stepped, an alluvium sorted by a century of moderate floods, all of it saying we have time if we make time. We turn homeward along a path that has begun to know our tread, and we try to leave less of it each day, letting grass spring back, letting dust fall undisturbed, letting spider silk remain a bridge instead of a tear. Maybe the practical tenderness we promised is no more complicated than this. Carry what you can, lighten what you must. Teach your tools to bow and keep enough quiet in your pocket to pay for the attention of places that have been paying attention long before you arrived. The ridge lies behind, the river beside, the cave below, the sky above, and in that compass our maps feel suddenly spacious, as if directions are less about distance and more about kinds of time, storm time, root time, stone time, each asking for a different pace. Maybe, maybe not. We leave the gate as we found it and listen for the latch to whisper closed. Evening begins again as if no one had ever thought to doubt it, and our footsteps thin to the patient measure of shadows lengthening. The day has asked nothing dramatic of us and given us everything necessary: heat enough to soften, light enough to read, wind enough to clean the edges of thought, water enough to keep the chorus in tune. And yet, if carrying the night's pace into morning can make the world more legible, then another question waits at the threshold of dusk. How do we carry the day's clarity back into the dark? What small rituals will keep our instruments humble, our metaphors honest, our sleep tuned to the long breath of the ground, so that tomorrow's listening begins one note closer to true? And how do we carry the day's clarity back into the dark? What small rituals will keep our instruments humble, our metaphors honest, our sleep tuned to the long breath of the ground, so that tomorrow's listening begins one note closer to true? We dim the lamps before we need to, letting twilight complete the handoff, and we set our notebooks down the way one sets down a stone that has already told its story. We rinse the dust from our palms, not because the dust is dirty, but because clean hands remember better. The water runs cool over knuckles and carries traces of feldspar and loam to the drain like a quiet procession, and in that small gesture we practice the larger physics: energy released without drama, edges softened without loss. We speak softly across the room and let disagreement find a lower key, an entropy of tone that turns heat into light. Could it be that truth is more audible when our voices cool, when data and doubt share the same chair and take turns? Maybe not. We draft our questions as if they were field plots, bounded, tended, open to weather, and we tuck them beside the window where night can reduce their glare to stars. We place the cores and thin sections back into their cases with a slowness that resembles care rather than fear, breathing out as we latch each one, and we leave a note for morning in the language of process rather than outcome. Measure again, but slower. Check the isotope standards like a tide checking a shore. Watch for drift, not as a flaw, but as a message. Outside, the sky performs its ancient trick of becoming ocean upside down, clouds shifting into shoals and then into nothing, and we take this as instruction: let attention be tidal, flood with focus, ebb with trust, leave the flats open for birds and for doubt. We darken screens and turn our facing to the window, where a single planet hangs like a patient instrument waiting to be tuned, and we feel the small relief that arrives when the work agrees to continue without us, when decay and diffusion keep reorganizing the world toward coherence in our absence, not because we are unnecessary, but because the system is generous and asks only that we participate in the tempo it prefers. We light a lamp that smells faintly of beeswax, and set it far enough from the page that the paper does not warm, learning from caves how to write without altering the archive, learning from reefs how to build in ways that shade without stealing, learning from rivers how to correct quietly. Could it be that ritual is just physics made kind, heat kept low, light directional, thresholds respected, flows unforced? We repeat the evening's small sequence the way valves repeat winter and summer: door closed softly, boots brushed without scouring, samples logged without claims, gratitude spoken without an audience. In the silence that follows, we hear the building settle, frames easing like talus after sun, a structural memory adjusting by millimeters, and we trust it the way cliffs trust freeze and thaw to compose them into slopes that hold. Maybe the ground keeps score of how gently we set things down, maybe it does not. Either way, the practice alters us into steadier company. We turn our attention to sleep the way orbit turns toward eclipse, not as a failure of light, but as a condition that allows other wavelengths to speak. Breath lengthens, matching the slow arithmetic we've been studying all day: erosions, subtraction, depositions, addition, metamorphisms, substitution, subductions, parentheses, operations that take centuries to resolve and yet remain legible in the morning. Is it possible that the mind, set at this pace, becomes an instrument for hearing evidence at volumes we usually miss? The faint lean in carbon that winter saved in cellulose, the soft correction in oxygen that a lake wrote when wind remembered how to cross it, the quiet forgiveness in nitrogen where floodplains reopened their books. We do not demand dreams, we invite them like migratory birds with water left shallow and safe, and if they come, they carry images that behave like evidence: slow rivers, thin ash, a cliff translating wind into stone. Before the lamp goes out, we make a last small promise in the margin: to measure with the patience we ask of mountains, to compare with the humility we admire in corals, to publish with the evenness we crave from climate. We let repetition do the rest, not because repetition is trance, but because it is tide, and tide is memory that moves. Maybe our bodies will become better instruments if night is kept dark and morning is kept gentle. If food keeps the pace of seasons, and worry keeps the pace of weather, arriving, being acknowledged, moving on, maybe not. The page takes the ink without complaint and dries at its own speed, a quiet collaboration between solvent and air, pigment and fiber, gravity and time. We step to the door and listen for the city's low murmur, for the moths at the window, for the faint crack in the wall that sounds, if you are patient, like a granite hillside cooling into mica and feldspar. Someone on the street laughs, and the sound rounds off, accepted by brick and night and leaf, as if designed for absorption. Entropy works on laughter too, turning it into heat that leaves with the rest. We switch the lamp to off, and let the room be a cave that makes no claims on the day it kept, a chamber where the air can settle into layers delicate as lake light in winter. And yet, if this is how proof and wonder can share a pillow, if this is how instruments sleep and wake without forgetting their manners, then tomorrow's first question arrives already softened. Not what can we extract, but what will the ground offer if we ask as gently as the tide? And not what can we extract, but what will the ground offer if we ask as gently as the tide? We walk out beneath a pale morning where the horizon loosens its fist, and we let our question travel at the speed of dew. We picture a coastline that was once an argument of concrete and now learns to breathe again, a shore rebuilt into marsh and dune, where the wind writes curves no ruler can command, not because we surrendered, but because we chose a language the ocean already speaks. Maybe the ground offers silt when we return a floodplain, offers shade when we spare an old grove, offers steadier water when we slow the hillside with terraces that remember contour. Maybe not. We arrive like careful guests and wait for the first answer to come as texture, a riverbed that holds its gravel, a peat that thickens without complaint, a cave ring rounding its edge where bitter days have grown rare. We kneel in a field that has learned a slower appetite, and the soil gives us a small brightness when turned, threads of mycelium mapping a city we never planned, nodules where microbes keep their quiet covenants, a cool that persists into noon. Could it be that generosity is a gradient more than a gift, that the ground teaches us by easing, not by offering, a carbon curve leaning toward calm, a nitrogen tone softened back into the voices of flood and grass, a line of oxygen in water repeating its day-night hymn without stutter? We listen for the old patient syllables: erosions edit, depositions filing, metamorphisms translation, subductions assurance that nothing loved by chemistry is ever lost, only renamed. We do not take more than measures, we leave less than a footprint. We ask for permission in the practical ways: clean tools, light hands, holes that close themselves when the rain remembers. By the coast we watch the small arithmetic of oysters turn turbidity into clarity, each shell a ledger line turning excess into habitat. Eelgrass recites its slow poem of friction, taming waves into rooms where fishware grows less hurried, not because we rebuilt a monument, but because we withdrew with intention, leaving space for what knows how to arrive. Is it possible that the ground's best answer is the return of ordinary storm scars that read like notes in margins instead of torn chapters, dunes that walk again without fleeing, berms that lay down in even intervals the way sleep returns on good nights? We keep our instruments honest to these modest victories, calibrating them against long memory, valves stacking evenly, stalagmites keeping tempo, tree rings widening, then narrowing like a chest at rest. We resist applause and choose a rhythm that keeps us attentive. In the mountains, the slope offers us a trail that doesn't unravel, a patchwork of burns that edit fuel without grievance, snow that lingers into the month it used to call home. The ground's answer here is less about bounty than about permission to pass, to watch, to learn the names of rocks as verbs. Shale that yields, granite that holds, schist that shines with pressure's patience. We think of fossils as agreements more than remains, bones to calcite, wood to stone, presence to pattern, and we ask whether our tools can sign similar contracts, steel agreeing to become ironstone without bitterness, glass learning to be sand with grace, polymers consenting to clay. Maybe, maybe not. Entropy is our ally if we design in its dialect, if we ask endings to be useful, if we let decay become choreography instead of collapse. The ground answers this in the softest ways: fewer sharp edges in storm debris, fewer bright fragments in beach wrack, more colors that belong to minerals the crust already trusts. A wind slips from the lake with a taste of old limestone and new rain, and we think of isotope trails that memorize such mornings. Oxygen 18 telling future ice of today's mildness. Carbon in reeds folding this hour into the arithmetic of marsh. Hydrogen writing a small footnote about a storm that did not need to be large to be generous. Could it be that the most faithful record we leave will be a suite of absences, of noise returned to signal, of spikes eased into curves, of anomalies that declined a second appearance? We open our palms and let the possibility rest there like a river stone, warmed by sun and cooled by water. It is not proof, it is posture. The planet speaks in long sentences. Our best reply, perhaps, is punctuation placed with care, a comma where we once used an exclamation, a period where we once denied sleep. Evening returns as if it never forgot the way, blue folding into grasses, and the first crickets tuning their small clocks. We sit with the day's quiet arithmetic, and count only what counts slowly: the steadiness of a stream, the evenness of a breeze, the patience of a slope that stayed where it belonged. Atmosphere is settling into its night ledger, auroras somewhere far off writing in green, what we cannot read here, and above all of it, orbits keep time without asking our permission. The ground has answered us with coherence, not with spectacle, and we take the lesson as lightly as dust that does not stain. And yet, if this is how the earth says yes, through middles restored and edges softened, then another wondering rises like a gentle tide at dark. What of the stories that never touch ground at all, the rumors that pass through water and light, the memories carried by creatures who cross epochs in their genes? What might the living archives remember that stone cannot, and how softly can we ask them to share? And what might the living archives remember that stone cannot, and how softly can we ask them to share? We sit at the edge of a wetland while evening trades gold for blue, and we let the reeds begin the lesson. They move in a language of small agreements, blade to breeze, breeze to ripple, ripple to the slow arithmetic of peat. And within that choreography, memory is not carved but carried, not fixed but rehearsed each dusk. We watch dragonflies stitch the air with thin bright thread, their bodies built from elements a glacier ground from granite, and a river taught to travel. They have no fossils yet, but their wings remember lakes that came and went and came again. Could it be that genes are a kind of layered silt, that instinct is a valve laid down in the dark of the mind, that migration routes are maps sketched and re-sketched in the blood, passed like quiet tools between generations? Maybe, maybe not. We let the chorus widen, frogs testing the temperature of the night, mosquitoes reading the humidity with mouths, as if the day must be translated into 1,000 small decisions before it can sleep. In the trees, a thrush takes up a song it did not invent, notes braided from ancestors who learned the shape of seasons by listening to light lengthen and shorten, to insects begin and end, to rivers loosen and tighten across the stones. The river's oxygen curves through their bodies and returns as song, a loop where water becomes memory and memory becomes sound. No rock keeps that refrain, but the air does, and the air offers it back to leaves that pulse in time. Is it possible that every field guide is a thin translation of a much older text, the one written in proteins that fold the same way every dawn, and in circadian clocks that count without scolding? In salmon who smell their birth water in parts per trillion and swim home through a labyrinth of time? We imagine isotope trails as signatures inside muscle and shell, oxygen in scales mirroring the temperatures of far oceans, carbon in feathers telling of drought or abundance miles inland, nitrogen in plankton rising and falling with quiet upwellings. No graph can capture alone. The living ledger is continuous. It does not skip pages when the weather leans or when we do. At the reef's edge, polyps open as the light thins, each mouth a small archive of chemistry, path, warmth, the slow tide of carbonate, and each limestone apartment a transcript of the sea's accent that year. We think of bleaching as a pause in the song rather than a forgetting, a rest that can return to melody if shade and cool and time are granted their lines. Coral skeletons will tell later of a decade when the water spoke harshly and then learned a gentler grammar again. Not because mercy is guaranteed, but because feedbacks keep offering balance like driftwood to swimmers again and again if we stop pushing the waves. Fish move like phrases between shadows, and their otoliths grow rings that a patient blade can read. Winter's thick, summer's thin, famine, written as translucent hesitation. Could it be that a civilization's brief fever will be more legible in these bones than in ours, their calcium diaries catching the lean of nitrogen and the whisper of metals, their roots bending with currents that changed because wind forgot and remembered its old paths? Maybe, maybe not. The sea is faithful to its long sentences. We listen by staying. On land, a stand of pines keeps time in resin, sealing wounds with a chemistry tuned to flame that arrives in mosaics, not sheets. When seasons remember themselves, cones open under moderated heat and close again under rain, a ritual that binds weather to seed and seed to weather in a patience stone cannot imitate. In lichens we find the oldest librarians of air, slow partners of fungus and alga that grow by millimeters and keep the taste of centuries in their soft bodies. Sulfate and dust and salt and soot, each saved without drama under a skin that knows more days than we do. We kneel and breathe gently across a patchy rock and consider how little a witness needs to keep faith. A surface, a partnership, a shaded hour. Entropy moves through these archives with the softness of sleep, turning leaf to litter to loam, and in that transmission the instructions are repeated often enough to outlast any one mouth that carries them. We are being shown how to last, not by insisting, but by rehearsing kindness until it becomes reflex. We think of whales holding the weight of ice ages in their migration, roots that loop across decades like slow handwriting, notes kept in the thick book of fat that reads like weather, like prey, like distant shelves of plankton rising with the moon's oldest math. Their songs can cross basins, their scars can cross lifetimes. Their breath can bend the sky's chemistry at the scale of moments, giving and taking in a shared metabolism that coral joins and forest echoes and seabirds stitch overhead. Is it possible that the strongest archive is the one that moves genes carried by fins and wings and feet, learned paths carried by memory and taught again in bodies that never knew the first reason why? The stone keeps the nouns, the living keep the verbs, and the story stays legible because both are needed. We let this split calm our hunger for proof we can hold. Some things we must follow, not store. If there were hands before ours, perhaps their best traces persisted here, in temperate habits that made rivers generous, in diets that left forests diverse, in migration paths uninterrupted long enough that animals forgot to be surprised. Perhaps their worst traces lingered briefly as symptoms, the living read and corrected. Breeding seasons shifted, routes revised, songs changed key for a time, before the choir learned to sing in tune again. Maybe not. Our work is not to conjure ghosts, but to hear the living archive without asking it to confess. To weigh feathers and fish ear bones and tree rings with the same respect we give to zircon and tektite. To accept that certainty in biology is often a probability with manners. We make space in our notebooks for the songs we cannot name, and for the silences that are not empty but full of waiting. Night settles with the soft authority of deep time, and the marsh resumes its slow breathing. Fireflies write over water like a script that refuses permanence on purpose, and a heron steps into the margin where reflection begins and ends, where world and echo learn each other's patience. We feel ourselves loosen into the pace of what survives by repeating breath, tide, season, drift. And in that loosening the question changes shape. And yet, if the living memory can carry what stone cannot, if genes and roots and songs remember across forgotten epochs, then the next gentle wonder turns toward us. What can we teach it that it will want to keep? And how small must our lessons be, so that they fit comfortably inside a wing beat, a root tip, a tide? And what can we teach it that it will want to keep? And how small must our lessons be, so that they fit comfortably inside a wing beat, a root tip, a tide? We imagine offerings scaled to breath, corridors not drawn on maps but grown as hedgerows that stitch meadows to woods, lights dimmed to the colour of moth safety, fences that remember to kneel when herds come through. We picture seeds chosen for patience rather than spectacle, shorelines given back the right to move, fires invited at the right cool to teach forests their letters again, not because we know better, but because we can learn to follow. Maybe a salmon run needs only a cooler bend and a gravel cleaned of silt to remember its old sentence. Maybe a crane needs only a quiet sky to keep the line between marshes unbroken. Maybe not. We place these maybes like stones in a ford and step between them slowly, letting water speak around our ankles, reading its grammar in temperature and flow, in the slightly heavier oxygen it wears by afternoon, in the light carbon leaf shade gives it by night. We think of instruction that wears the planet's dialect, soil taught to hold rain by roots that barter sugars for structure, dunes taught to walk by grasses that comb wind into low hills, reefs taught to cool by forests inland that lift clouds with their own transpiration, the lesson not a command but an encouragement, like a hand under a fledgling that will fly anyway. Could it be that the only teachings that last are those that can be carried in bodies, migration restored by opening a gate rather than by moving a bird, pollination restored by dark that lets moths keep their hours, river grammar restored by floodplains that accept the long sentence of water? We test for memory in rings and bands and shells, watching for evenness to return, tree rings that relax toward middle widths, stalagmite layers that round without bitterness, foraminifera that rebuild chambers at sizes that speak of comfort. The isotope trails soften, nitrogen losing the sharp tone of hurry, carbon choosing balance, oxygen stepping back into season. Instruction shrinks again to gestures nearly invisible, a culvert lifted an inch so fish can read current, a path braided across rock so lichens keep their maps, a field left ragged at the edges because neatness is a kind of famine for small lives. We accept that we will not be named in the record and let relief arrive. If gratitude exists, it may appear as coherence, as boredom of a blessed kind, as curves that become unremarkable and stay that way for a very long time. Is it possible that self-erasure is not disappearance but translation, as becoming soil habits and wind manners and water, patience that other species can use without knowing we were there? Maybe the whales will remember us only as a slackening of noise along their route, the corals as a stretch of shade that let a fever pass, the pines as a century where fires returned to a tone they could sing to. Maybe not. We lay the thought down the way silt lays down under a slack tide, a fine hush that builds land by being ordinary. At dusk we sit where river turns to estuary and watch instructions travel without words. Salt meeting fresh and teaching fish gills how to change. Cold meeting warm and teaching fog how to rise. Tide meeting root and teaching marsh how to hold. The lesson moves through bodies the way a rumour moves through reeds. Flex, return, flex, until it is no longer rumour but custom. We whisper our last additions into this older curriculum, a bridge for crabs beneath a road, a fallow stripe along a field, a shutdown hour when cities learn to breathe like forests. The atmosphere takes notes in its thin script, hallows in ice, ratios in rain, small mercies folded into clouds and stone, patient beyond praise, will answer late with minerals that grow clear, with slopes that weather to soils that welcome. Ocean subduction will carry a page or two under, as it must. Margins will keep their quilt of fragments. Mountains will lift them someday with an accent of our restraint rather than our noise. Night spreads its dark like good ink, and stars appear at a pace that feels negotiated, one after another without hurry. Our eyes adjust, and so do our questions. What if the best of us can be taught to travel in the lightest ways, encoded not in monuments but in habits that species borrow because they feel like relief? Could it be that the living archive will keep a handful of our smallest lessons if we teach them gently enough, the way a path learns to be narrower after rain, the way a town learns to dim itself in migration season, the way a farm learns to share its edges? We do not expect a thank you. We expect at most a continuation, rings that do not panic, bands that do not break, songs that do not stop mid-note. And yet, as the tide turns under the moon's old arithmetic, and a heron lifts from the margin with a sound too soft to name, another wandering rises like mist from water cooled by evening. If such small teachings can last, what else, even smaller, might we learn to give? What prayer-sized adjustment would let the future breathe a fraction easier, and would we trust it enough to leave it unsigned?